Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Break the Rules live stream. I am your host, Lev Polyakov, and we are here today once again with JP Lindsley, Vlad Davidzon, Senior Fellow of the Atlantic Council, Brian O'Shea, who we have not seen in a very long time, former U.S. Special Forces Intel, really smart dude, I can't wait to get into it, and we have Mike Cote for the very first time. Mike, it is a great pleasure to have you here on BTR. And we are here talking about a couple of things. We're going to be talking about the SignalGate fiasco that's currently afoot. And we're also going to be talking once again about Russia versus Ukraine, the latest developments there, whether or not there's going to be differences going on from Trump's end towards what's going on, for better or worse. We will find out. But first, I want to address something that I think has not really been talked about all that much, which is important, and it has to do with a lady named Jessica Aber. She was a former federal prosecutor for the Eastern District of Virginia, and she was engaged in finding out leaks of CIA info, cyber attacks from Russia, and she was found dead on March 22 at 43 years old. Hardly anybody talks about her death. Few people write about her because, again, like right now we have this whole Signal incident that occurred, but somebody's got to talk about it. So I just wanted to quickly address some of the things that have gone on here. So first of all, like how did she die, and what exactly did she do? Like, her death seems to be one of these stories that, should quietly retreat into the background, just a tragic headline that people should forget. But when you have a professional prosecutor who spent her whole life chasing Russian cyber criminals, CIA leaks, and war criminals, and she turns out to be dead just a few weeks after resignation, forgetting it, I don't think, is an option. So in February, before her resignation, she helped jail Asif Rahman, who was a former CIA analyst, for leaking the top secret info related to Israeli military plans against Iran. And she did not hesitate to express herself when Rahman pleaded guilty. She warned his leak was life-threatening and, quote, put our ability to collect vital intelligence in the future. And her affairs did not end here. In November 2024, her office brought to justice a Virginia company accused of transferring confidential U.S. tech to a Russian telecommunications firm with ties to the Kremlin. And then the incident of war crimes followed. Aber's office accused 4 persons connected of Russia of torture and illegal detention of a U.S. citizen in Ukraine. And she didn't just create legal noise, she put serious pressure on influential figures with deep connections, oligarchs, cyber criminals, and corrupt players with resources to make problems disappear. And she resigned in February 25, shortly after Donald Trump returned to power, and no one said she was forced to leave, but the departure of one of the most powerful U.S. prosecutors in the country just weeks after the arrest of a fraudulent CIA analyst, it seems a little bit too obvious. It's not hard to imagine why somebody like Aber, who's a Democrat, can suddenly find themselves in a difficult position. Trump's return has been accompanied by a wave of loyalty checks and reshuffles in the Justice Department, and Aber's aggressive persecution of Russian contacts and CIA leaks is not quite a team player in this new political climate, and it's a new path, you could say. If she was forced to resign, what deeds were buried quietly when she left, we will no longer know. Anyway, in July 24, the Supreme Court ruling granted Trump nearly complete immunity from core presidential powers, including military command, etc. Judge Sonia Sotomayor warned the decision could allow the president to serve a murder order and not face any legal consequences. By the time Aber retired, this ruling had already cast a long shadow on the Justice Department. Prosecutors like Aber, who looked after influential players with foreign and Russian ties, now worked in an environment where accountability had been overturned. If Aber's investigations found something that would threaten influential interests, the court's ruling would have eased pressure on those interests, or worse, without consequences. Her resignation may or may not have been voluntary, but by the time Aber left her post, the fences protecting prosecutors like her had already collapsed. Maybe her death was a horrible coincidence. Maybe not. While she did have epileptic seizures, she found a way to manage it, and in her case, in terms of the kind of work that she was doing, I'm sure that by the time that she got to doing a lot of these, top prosecutorial jobs, she managed to find a way to deal with a lot of these twitches and epileptic seizures. But that's right now what they're saying is the reason for her death. But when people who investigate corruption are found to be dead, I think that there is only one responsible action left, and it's to start asking questions. So this has not as much to do with the SignalGate and the stories that we're going to get into, but at the same time, I think it's extremely important not to let something like this fly. So I don't know if you guys have any comments on this before we continue. JP, Brian, Mike, Vlad, you guys have the floor for that, and then we're going to move on right into SignalGate.
Well, Lev, I'll just say, I mean, from here in Kyiv, I've not been able to follow the story closely at all, but as a muckraking journalist who always believes in pursuing the truth, I'm glad you mentioned her story, and it's something that should be pursued. And I'm a big believer in, especially when we have some major story that's occupying our attention, in this case, SignalGate, whatever you want to call it, always a good time to make sure, as an editor, I would, tell my team, that's when you step back and say, hey, what are we missing? And always make sure you have other people covering the other stories. Simply as a matter of fairness, too, to make sure these other stories are not neglected. And so I have nothing else to offer on it, but I'm glad, as a journalist, I'm glad that you are mentioning her story. It's important to look into.
Thank you. And Brian, any thoughts on Aber? I don't know how familiar you are with that case.
It's like, it came across. I mean, there's so much news, but I did bookmark it. So, I got a lot of things bookmark just because, as all the other journalists know, you've got to do that or you forget. But I did see it. I will say the timing is extremely weird. And there seem to be a lot of deaths of prosecutors. And aren't there like 2 other ones that are kind of related to her? So I don't chase theories, though. I collect facts and then I let them form the theories for me. So once I get to this, I'll give you an update, but it is something I do want to look into. And it wasn't so much her death that I found suspicious. It was the lack of coverage of a Biden appointee that I found suspicious.
Fair enough. Mike, Vlad, any comments on that? And if not, we're going to move on.
Yeah, on my end, it's just it's tragic anytime someone that age in the prime of their career passes away, whether it's nefarious reasons or just natural causes. So mentioning her name and kind of focusing on that, I think, is a useful way to at least keep her name in the press and in people's memories.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's an elegant and generous and gracious thing to say, Mike. So that I'd like to, follow up with that. I would just say that Russia does not get away with killing American officials on American territory. Russians do not do that in America. Russians do go around killing all sorts of people and making hits in Europe and in Asia and certainly in Africa. Actually, the Russian army runs around Africa and killing large amounts of people. And they do engage in sabotage operations in Warsaw and in Poland, where I'm going actually in a couple of days, in London, certainly in France. We've had multiple defectors get killed. We've seen all sorts of enemies of the Russian state get killed in Germany. Just recently, a Chechen with a Georgian passport was killed by Russian intelligence in a park in Germany. But they never, ever, ever kill anybody who is an American serviceman, intelligence officer, prosecutor, congressman, whatever. Anyone important in America. America is still a place where they will not ever, take certain kinds of risks. So I certainly, unless something has changed, we are in a time of tremendous change. It's entirely possible that they've switched their position now, that they're going to start taking out hits on American soil, which would certainly be an escalation. The Iranians have tried to do that, but I don't believe it was a Russian hit just because not having studied the story. I just don't believe that they do that kind of thing. Needs to be investigated, but that was just my point.
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And I think it does tie into what we're going to be talking about right now with SignalGate, because this is a question that a lot of people who were critical of the Trump admin have been asking themselves. is the situation, whether or not you're even talking about the account being hacked into or somebody making a mistake, but it not really being related to any classified information. Even if we set all of that aside, the fact that we were having people who are, the top people of the Trump administration inside of a Signal group, which, say what you want about Signal security, it is still possible to hack a phone and to then be able to get all of these messages from Signal without necessarily hacking Signal itself. So just in terms of people looking, without having any additional pieces of information that may change their mind, just them looking at the situation, I'm sure it's pretty reasonable for them to say, like, wait a minute, this seems very incompetent. Why are they doing this? Isn't this something that would make, Alan Dulles spin in his grave, from a lack of procedure? So I don't know. Brian, what say you? You've been following the story for a bit. Let me know.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's Signal, right? And if you have auto-populate on and, you have someone, I guess the journalist was using his initials JG. And there is, I forgot that it's a new administration, but there is someone in the administration, I think in finance, with the same initials. So it's very likely. I haven't heard any of them deny it happened. It seems like the argument is, did they disclose classified? Which I think a lot of people don't understand, that even if they did, they can't say it in a public hearing. Because they're giving away, basically, I mean, they're just not allowed to disclose. So and then they're putting it up on the slide projector today. And, for Greenberg, I believe is his name.
Goldberg.
Goldberg, thank you. I did a really late podcast last night and a really early morning. I thought it was Friday. I've been all discombobulated, so thank you. But, he also has to consider that he was on that chat for about 5 days, from what I understand. And he never reported that he might be in receipt of classified information. So I like to put out like a bunch of ideas and try to chase him down. But if I were him, I'd be concerned that I got set up.
JP, what are your thoughts on the setup?
Well, Signal. Here in Ukraine, I use Signal every day. In fact, pretty much every Ukrainian, even volunteers and military, learned how to use Signal in the first few weeks of February, March 2022. People realized you have to have OPSEC. It was a learning process quite rapidly, and people managed it. And one thing you realize is when you have a Signal chat, that you have to really make sure who's in the chat. The names can be different and changed. And we've managed it for 3 years. And these are like simple, volunteers who are making drones after their day job. People know how to do it. So at the White House level, you should have this stuff organized well. And so that is simply unprofessional. When I look at the, all the excuses and all that, there's really no room for excuse at that. They should just say we made a mistake. In fact, we made a parody video. I posted my team made this video. We posted on Instagram. Has 1 million views now. With this the famous British comedic duo Little Britain, and they had this skit of a Tory minister making up excuses when he got into very embarrassing situations that he put himself in, and that's kind of what I saw with this. But for me, the most interesting thing from this is what was revealed by the thought process, and it's something that I've been keenly paying attention to, especially going back to that Trump-Zelensky White House meeting. And there was the message from Vice President Vance, and in the message from Vance, he's saying that he agrees in principle to these strikes, but he says, but he's like, we can't do it yet because the public won't understand. And you really see, for someone like Vance, the most important thing is the messaging, and if the public doesn't understand it, he won't do it. Okay, and that's just very helpful information to know. I wish that, I think that, like, Zelensky and his team should be paying attention to that. If you're trying to convince America of something, this is a key window into how they think. Sure. And another key insight from that same 2 or 3 paragraphs from J.D. Vance, he's saying to like these 18 people in that chat that the principal, that President Trump is not aware of some of the things that they are aware of. And now, for me, as someone who worked, one of my mentors was the chairman of Fox News, Roger Ailes. It's not surprising to have the super powerful people be unaware of very basic things. But this is a clear piece of evidence that is indeed the reality in this White House, that there's a lot of things that the president might not be aware of, that even his other senior people are, and that there's a lot of debate that's happening within the White House. So I think it actually gives, I mean, look, it's dangerous for our enemies, perhaps, but I think it's a pretty normal picture of how White Houses work in that sense. And but I when I listen to the excuses from from Mike Waltz and others, come on, just own up to your mistake and get over it. The more they make excuses, the worse the problem gets.
Do you think, and then I'm going to bring this to Mike Cote, do you think that the problem lies in using this app to begin with? Where, let's say somebody like Vladimir Putin, Brian, I remember we were having an argument before about, whether Vladimir Putin is smart. And you know what? I'm going to give it to you. You're right. He is smarter when it comes to his OPSEC, because Putin doesn't use the internet and he has people hand him messages that are handwritten. He is very afraid of putting anything online because I think he does have that old KGB spook mentality, which I think a lot of people today would benefit from. And again, like maybe I'm completely naive about this, but just the fact that they're using this app to me is a big red flag. I don't know. I really want to hear from Mike, though. You haven't really had that much of a chance to talk. But before Mike, JP, any quick thoughts on that?
No, I'll let Mike. You have not had a chance to talk, so I'll pass it off to you.
Oh, no problem.
Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, to go off JP's point, the excuse making, I think, is counterproductive. I think it keeps the story in the news when it's not necessary to keep it in the news. I mean, again, looking back at what this was all about, forget the signal chat, all of that. This was about striking the Houthis and doing something that I think a lot of Americans would be happy with. Hitting terrorists that have been attacking American naval vessels for over a year is a good thing. And I think the more that the administration focuses on trying to clean up the mess that they've made with adding a journalist to a signal group, I think that kind of deflects from what they should be focusing on, which is the success of striking this terrorist group that has been hitting Americans for over a year and trying to sink neutral shipping. These are things, again, that have been longstanding American interests in terms of freedom of navigation, keeping sea lanes open, and especially doing it against an adversary, one that is backed by a greater adversary in Iran. So I think the administration did doing something good in this, and I think the problem is they're so worried about not looking bad in front of the principal, in front of Trump, that they're kind of focusing on trying to clean this up versus saying, hey, we made a mistake here. We should not have added this journalist to this group. We'll do better in our operational security or our planning going forward. And then switch it back to what actually happened, which was, to all extents and purposes, seems like a success. So I think fixing that messaging would be a big deal here. And I think the story has hung on much longer than it would have otherwise, just because of the fact that there are so many denials and sorts of switches of position and things like that. And I just think that's counterproductive when you're actually talking about something that on its face was actually, I think for the most part, quite good. I do think it is also useful what JP was talking about what people know and what people don't know in terms of higher ups in the administration. Trump always seemed to me like a very hands-off manager. He's happy to fire people when they screw up, but I don't think he's going to stick his fingers into every single thing unless it's really one of his, hobby horses like tariffs seems to be. But besides that, it seems like he's more than happy to delegate, and then when people mess up, fire them. I think in this case, he doesn't really care too much about what's been happening here because, again, of the framing of the administration about this being I think the press secretary was calling it a false claim, maybe a hoax. I just don't think that's useful. Again, getting it back to the core of the matter would, I think, be beneficial for the administration because this is something I think, again, after a year plus of the Biden administration playing defense, going on offense against terrorists is always a winning issue for Americans.
It's definitely a winning issue. I want to get Vlad into this, but I do want to follow up to what you said with a bit of a disagreement. When it comes to what you're talking about with the Houthis, absolutely sure, 100%. But there is still this whole matter of them using this app, which doesn't sit right with me, because I still feel that for somebody, again, like Vladimir Putin, who wouldn't dare writing anything online at all because he fears this being transferred to somewhere else, as he probably should be, the fact that we have people who are in the top positions of the U.S. government that are just using some app on their phones. And again, I don't know the extent to which...
Lev,
yes.
Lev, I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Go for it.
Their phones would be hardened phones, as known in intelligence. These guys are 18 guys. I don't know if there were any women on that call who had the kinds of phones that are
Tulsi
harder to
Gabbard.
intercept. These are, I mean, probably Witkoff should not have been using that app while he was in Russia. If Witkoff was in Moscow, as some of the reports have said, I haven't checked. I haven't cared enough to look into whether Witkoff was in Moscow when this happened. Some people who want to score political points have said that. If that's true, probably the Russians could have gone in there. This is not great. But again, Witkoff was probably on a burner phone or something like that while he was in Russia. Envoys have the best security that our intelligence services can give them. That aside, look, it's obviously a narrative of amateur hour with anything having to do with Trump. So his enemies are happy to pounce on this. This is obviously a security lapse. Should they get rid of a national security advisor and a defense DOD head over this? Probably not. It's a major security lapse. It looks bad. They don't look like they're particularly efficient at security. Doesn't look great. I'm not that partisan on this kind of silly nonsense. I wouldn't call for the heads of 3 or 4 cabinet level guys over this. I don't know. Brian, you're shaking your hand.
Hey, Vlad, wait, can I?
Oh no, I was
sorry,
rocking while I was listening. That's all.
Yeah,
Vlad,
JP.
let me jump in on because for me this is concerning, but it's concerning because I see it as part of a pattern.
Okay.
And so I see it as a pattern of, so for example, take the case of Witkoff, like 'cause the reality that I see here in Ukraine. So when Witkoff, as Trump's envoy to the Middle East and to Russia,
Right.
he's been speaking about Moscow's proposed ceasefire in the Black Sea. He should be an expert on this. He should be well informed by the people that work for him. And yet, so the other day he said the Ukrainian ships and the Russian ships need to stop shooting at each other. There are no Ukrainian ships in the Black Sea. Ukraine doesn't have a navy. And in fact, there's barely any
Sadly.
Russian ships in the Black Sea because Ukraine, with their sea drones since 2023, since that sort of very weak United Nations deal expired in 2023, the useless nations, when that expired, Ukraine was able to fight back. And since then, the Black Sea has become pacified. There is no fire to cease there, actually, right now. And so
Well, no,
know,
JP.
this-
JP. Of the 74, 75 ships that the Russians had, a third have been incapacitated or sunk. We know that they've been pushed away into the other end of the Black Sea. They can't operate off of the Nikolaev. Nikolaev.
So what I'm saying is
Yes.
there really, for the most part, there are no Russian ships sailing and operating in the Black Sea. The more we go into big detail on it, the more people will not listen. But this is the simple fact. There are,
Right.
and there's certainly no Ukrainian ships because Ukraine doesn't have a navy. But so for Witkoff to be, for example, saying this very basic thing is just not accurate, I'm not surprised to see very sloppy communications. We have a team of 18 people or a small group, like it's like some at your local church. I mean, okay, a Signal small group for your local church would be suitable. But here I just see a sloppiness and actually people who are not paying attention to the situation on the ground. And I see that every day with the reality that I see here in Ukraine and how little information the administration actually has because they don't send a team here. I mean, for example, I wish that Tulsi Gabbard would send a team right now to Ukraine to find the biolabs. She's got the power. Come over here, look for the biolabs, find the truth, or stop talking about it. And so what I see with this SignalGate is actually it's a window into a larger problem which is a team that is not operating or not using the power that they do have to get facts and information so they can make better decisions. So I'm not surprised by this behavior because I see it every day.
I want to
Okay.
make sure we all agree on this, though. So when it comes to Ukraine's capability in the sea right now, in the Black Sea, Brian, are you in agreement with what Joseph was talking about here?
About there being no Navy ships, no Ukrainian ships. I really don't know. That's not
He's
really
right.
my area.
He's right.
I know the politics
Ukrainian
around it,
Navy's
but I
been
don't.
sunk.
Okay, well, this is important because if we're talking about Witkoff here, see, what I want to try to do is I don't like this whole political back and forth ramming of horns. I don't really see a need for it right now, especially in these dire times. Instead, I think we should all focus like one big brain, with all of us being the synapses in this brain, and figure out where the weak links are. So as far as Witkoff, if we can agree, if we have enough evidence here to agree that Witkoff is not saying something that's accurate at all, that leads to a really important question of competence. So in that situation, yeah.
I just got to jump in. So I just want to talk about really quickly about SignalGate and all that.
Sure.
So one thing I always do when I look at these situations, because this honestly seems so out of character for all the people yelling and screaming, I go back and I baseline them. So I look at everyone's confirmation hearings. It was very stoic despite the ridiculous attacks. And then when I'm watching, like the director of the CIA, what do you mean, and all this, it just seems very like NBA drawing a foul. And, even Hegseth, because think about what they went through, all of these people during the confirmations. The only one that's been very stoic has been Tulsi Gabbard. So what I did notice while we were talking, I was multitasking. I was checking out Google Trends. And everyone is focused on this. And this isn't, look, I was in the Intel world for a long time. I was in actually the same units as Pete Hegseth. People like Pete Hegseth, who are tactical operators in very dangerous areas like I was, you don't make communication mistakes unless you want to. Plain and simple. And to let it go on, I mean, again, I go back to my original thought. I don't know, and I know I don't chase theories, so I'm putting one out. I'm not chasing it. But I am saying, based on the baseline of these people, what's happening at this hearing is out of character, because the people, I hate to get political. It's not political, but it just happens to me that the people who are screaming the loudest from the prosecutorial stage are the congressmen and senators who are saying you did this, have no military experience. They're just scoring public points. And it's unlike all of those people who are pretty well experienced people to even react to people like, the guy from California. And it's like, it'd be like me reacting to, I don't know, some Boy Scout who just got his, campfire badge. Like, you'd be like, you shot bad. I'd be like, no, I didn't. I mean, come on. I mean, it just seems like a performance to me. So the point of that, there's 3 rings of every circus. Let's look at the one that's not lit up.
That's an interesting way to look at it. My one concern, though, is that I want to make sure that rank, as prestigious as it is, as far as the things that people go through in the military, cannot become a blind spot when it comes to talking about these things, because then one can say, well, just because somebody was in the military and has all of this information, that renders them infallible. And I think we are all humans. We're not God. We are all fallible people who all have our own, sets of problems to deal with.
No, I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is that, of course people are fallible, but keep in mind, like Hegseth, for instance, he was in media as well. He knows all about leaks. He knows all about Signal better than Signal's not something that the military would use, of course. But everyone knows in the intelligence world for the longest time, you don't use Signal, and they're using Signal. And the Atlantic reporter, who's the worst person who could have gotten, just happens to get it for 5 days. Just something, because at some point, and I'll remember his name at some point, the finance guy with the same initials, JG. At some point, you're going to have drinks at PJ Clark's down there in the Capitol, and you're going to say, hey, man, so did you agree with me? I didn't hear you respond on that Signal text. He's going to be like, what the hell are you talking about? You see what I mean? And this went on for 5 days. So it
I
just
don't know.
seems like a setup to me.
Brian, I don't know. I honestly, I that was my first impression, and
Mm-hmm.
then they get raked over the coals. It's a very embarrassing thing to set yourself up for, just to show the fact that you're doing good on Yemen. I mean, like if
I agree.
that was my first impression. Also, what you just said was my cynical journalist take first. Then I looked around for evidence of that, and
Right.
then I think this is so embarrassing, and it gives so much political ammunition to your enemies. And yeah, 18 guys on one thing. These are all
Mm-hmm.
egotistical, very busy guys, and
Right.
no one's really checking initials. Mistakes like this happen, and this is
Of
such a
course.
stupid thing to
Mm-hmm.
to do. And also, it just shows JD Vance kind of backbiting on President Trump's decision-making process. It it doesn't show them to be entirely cohesive cast of characters. There's enough little things to make it look like this is exactly the kind of stupid thing that you would do if you were not trying to do something stupid.
Maybe.
Yeah.
And sorry to jump in on your sentence there. And look, I agree. And I think Ben Shapiro, I'm up and down with Ben Shapiro. I like him, then I don't like him, so I go back
Yeah.
and forth. But he does make some really great observations, and he's right. And what he said about Washington D.C., I love. He says it's 50% Veep and 50% House of Cards, and that's so true. And
Right.
so I would say, like, a quick anecdote. I know you got time, Lev, but I know you like this story. For instance, I was in a certain agency, and someone jokingly put out a report which basically described a terrorist group as having the same powers as the X-Men, using the business speak of the place I was working at. So it seemed kind of legit, but it was a funny thing, the weather, blah, blah, aeronautics, stratosphere, they're talking about storm. But if you were a casual observer and you just read it, you'd be like, oh my God, those are powerful weapons. He accidentally hit send. And when you hit send in these agencies, it goes up the chain. And they started mounting millions of dollars, setting up task force. Like, we got a real problem. We've never heard of this.
Mm-hmm.
The dude, and I knew the guy, and he's like, man, I think I screwed up. I'm like, oh, yeah, get away from me. So I'm just saying, Vlad. I'm agreeing with Vlad. Mistakes happen. But I will say this one last thing, and I'll land this plane.
Yeah.
We were all talking about Ukraine before this happened. Now, no
Mhm.
one's talking about Ukraine, and people are getting educated about the fact that we only have 4% of our shipping goes through the Red Sea. We're doing this for Europe.
Well,
Yeah,
we're
I
doing
mean, I
we're
guess-
doing it for the world system, Brian. I mean, we're
Right,
we're
but, you
doing
know,
this
that's the
because it's
message.
our job to keep
It's-
the sea lanes free. That's America's function in the world.
It's not our job. It's what we do, but it's not our duty. Our duty is first to Americans. And so what I'm saying, and that's the message that's coming out from the White House, like, hey, you should be happy we're doing this. Who cares about Signal? And that's what they did, but they got all eyes focused on this. And like I said earlier, and Vlad, by the way, none of us know. Like, then I love these conversations because none of us know, and we get to learn about each other, and that's
Whoa.
great.
Whoa, Vlad, be careful there, my friend. None of us know. Brian, you're absolutely
Go ahead,
right.
Lev.
I want to get JP and Mike in this as well. You're absolutely right. None of us know. But what we do know are the things that people like Charles Witkoff say when it comes to his view
Steven.
of Ukraine and the Navy. And I do want to get back to that, because if we are talking about whether they're just pretending to screw up for some greater purpose here, would there be some greater purpose to Charles Witkoff talking about false information regarding Ukraine and the Navy and all of that? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know what you would make of that. So
I'll pop in quick. I mean, I'll drop one last thing on the Signal thing. I just think there's a much easier way to get that message out than going through a bunch of hoops to do it. And I think, again, like Vlad was saying, it tends to make people look not competent. Especially, if you're just a average observer and this is the news story you're hearing, I feel like it reflects poorly on the administration.
Yeah.
Especially if you don't really know much about this kind of stuff, which the vast majority of news consumers don't really know much about the news. And so I think if they were trying to do that, it doesn't seem to be effective, in my opinion. And at the same time, I think a lot of this comes back to Trump. The guy himself, throughout his entire life and public career, which is like more than I've been alive, and growing up in the New York area, I'm very familiar with Donald Trump.
Same.
He's always been someone who's kind of been quick going fast, flying by the seat of his pants, changing things at a whim. And so far, I feel like we've seen that in some of the administration's policies in this second term. We did see it a bit in the first term, especially in the beginning when they were kind of getting their sea legs under them with the Muslim ban and things like that, just kind of not doing things in a way that would allow them to stick. And I think then that was an experience. I think now it's more just this is how Trump operates as a businessman. You know, he's quick, he does things fast. If something messes up, he'll fix it later. And I think that kind of attitude from the top does tend to trickle down in organizations. So that's really all I have to say about that. I mean, when it comes to Steve Witkoff, I don't think the guy is very competent. I feel bad for Marco Rubio being the nation's top diplomat and not actually getting to do his job, because it seems like Steve Witkoff's the one going to negotiate everywhere. But I mean, a guy who says he got played by Hamas, come on, that's not very hard.
Yeah.
That's hard to do. I think he's way too close with Qatar, for example. And again, I just think,
as are a couple of other people, but
yeah, and I think just with that negotiating strategy, it's so far I don't think he's had any big victories that have actually turned out successful. I mean, the ceasefire in Israel is one that they claim, but again, you can argue whether that was the best way to get that done, whether there are other ways to get hostages back, things like that. But again, yeah, I just don't think he's a very competent guy for the job. Doesn't really have any experience in the field. He negotiates deals, but business is not the same as diplomacy.
It's just strange that a lot of these things, whether we're talking about Witkoff or whether we're talking about other people within the Trump admin, their relation towards Ukraine versus towards Russia. So far, it seems, just as a casual, semi-casual observer, everything that's gone on right now has been more in Russia's favor than in Ukraine's, as far as whether we're talking about this new mineral update of the deal that gives America a lot of power but doesn't have any security guarantees for Ukraine at all. So, and I understand, Brian, your point about, like, what does America have to do with all of this at the end of the day, and I want to get into that because that is the most important point out of all of these other things here, because that is a valid perspective to have, but we have to look at the ramifications of that. But before we get into that part of it, when it does come to the people who are under Trump, do you think that there may also be a tendency to want to do things according to the circle of people that you're in, and anybody who says otherwise, the fear is, maybe Trump will even like this idea, but I'm not sure because all these other people around me don't like it, so I don't want to raise any red flags here, because a lot of the people back during Trump's first administration, sure, you could say, well, they had a lot of bad ideas, so he should have fired them. But still, this is the scenario that a lot of people may be seeing who are not big fans of Trump. They may be seeing a guy who does not want to hear things that he doesn't agree with, and the people below him are also of that mentality. And in that kind of an environment, isn't that like, a snake eating its own tail? Isn't that an environment that we want to try to fight against so that we're able to take care of any, gaps in knowledge? Because that's what I'm trying to do here, at least. So I don't know. I'm just I'm curious what you think about that part.
Me?
Yes, sir.
I think you just described Saddam Hussein, not Donald Trump. Actually, everything I've heard from his current cabinet, and even the ones back in the day, is that you get fired if you just become a yes man. And that's the quickest way to get fired. And according to them, okay, it's anecdotal, of course, but that's what he doesn't want. And according to his current, many, like Lee Zeldin has said this, they all like the fact that they can dissent. And we just presented that tonight when we talked about J.D. Vance disagreeing with this, and it's out there, and he's not fired. Well, you can't fire him, but he's not even reprimanded. And Trump's kind of like, yeah, whatever, okay, they're doing their thing. And I think Micah made a good point. He's really delegating the way I would want any general or CEO or anything to delegate, where like he's kind of doing it like like Carnegie with steel. Like Carnegie didn't know anything about steel, but he ran the biggest steel thing because he surrounded himself with the smartest people in the room. And there's going to be, you're going to have some duds. You're going to have some duds. You can't have that many cabinet members and have them all be straight A students and superstars. You're going to go through some people, just like anyone who runs a business knows that. They can't all be astronauts, as they say.
Yeah,
What was
I'll
the
actually-
disagreement?
I'll second what Brian
oh,
says
wait,
there.
before, what was the disagreement? Just so everybody knows, with JD Vance and Donald Trump here, that Trump was okay
Whatever
with.
you mentioned earlier about like, there's JD Vance kind of saying, hey, we got a cool. I think JP, you might have said it, or
Yeah, he simply said it wasn't necessarily a disagreement, but you could see, as you would see, I think in any context, working for any boss, he says, J.D. Vance said, the strongest reason to do this is, as POTUS said, is to send a message. But I am not sure the president is aware how inconsistent this is with his message on Europe right now. And I look at that, I see healthy debate. I'm glad to know that that's
Fine.
happening. It's a good thing. So.
Yeah, and
That's
I was gonna
completely
say-
innocuous.
Yeah, I was going to say I would second what Brian says in terms of Trump listening to different perspectives. I think it's mostly because he doesn't always have an opinion for himself. I think oftentimes he doesn't have an opinion for himself. I think he's a candidate that has had a couple of really strong ideas that have driven him into office twice, as well as just having a really powerful personality. I think that's the biggest part of it, to be honest. And I think he has a wide variety of opinions and different issues in his administration. I think the issue is that, does he listen to the last person he talked to? I think that's something that I've seen throughout the past few administrations that he's been in, that it seems like the last person he talks to is the one who he's sticking with until he talks to somebody else.
Now, if we are talking about, though, this, what Ryan was talking about, this tendency to have a diverse amount of people who talk about things that Trump may not necessarily agree with, is this the case currently for what I think is the most important issue, which is Russia versus Ukraine? Are we seeing people coming out of the woodwork to question Trump's policy and to have that be respected? Because so far, at least from what I understand, we have people like Kellogg, who was more on, like pro-Ukraine, pro-Zelensky side, and he's been kind of pushed to the side. So again, as a distant observer looking at that, it seems like, okay, somebody is not in agreement about what direction the United States should go with Ukraine, and now all of a sudden they're being, put out to pasture. I'm not saying that is the case, because I don't know what the inside baseball is over there, but I'm curious what you guys think. Let's go to JP. You haven't spoken in a while, so let me know. Do you share the same sentiment, or are maybe missing some details here?
Well, firstly, Lev, I'd say just take the specific case of General Kellogg. A nice guy. By the way, his daughter is in Kyiv. She does a lot of work for veterans here and for soldiers here in Kyiv. And she has her own opinions and very bravely still says her own opinions. But regarding her father, he's an old general, kind of an armchair approach. And he was not armed with the actual facts and reality that's happening here. For example, the city of Kharkiv, 30 miles from Russia, where I spend a lot of time, it is bombed all the time, and yet it is still this wonderful entrepreneurial city. There's no crime. The only danger is you're going to get blown up from the sky, but you're not going to get robbed on the streets. It's really this ideal city that Americans would love, and it's the most defiant place here and is closest to Russia. And Kellogg he's not armed with these stories, so he's not paying attention to those details, and I think that's part of the reason why he got sidelined. He didn't have an interesting case to make, and I think that, as I look at the message I was quoting from J.D. Vance, I think the essence of the Trump administration is that it is reflecting the mood of the people. I mean, we see Ronald Reagan in 1980 said, let's get rid of the Department of Education. Well, nothing ever happened, right? Everything just got bigger. And now that this stuff is actually happening.
Yeah, and TSA is being gotten rid of. Yeah, so I'm very happy about that. Yeah,
this is reflecting the mood of the people, and so it is with Ukraine. And one thing that I see, so some of the news that got obscured this week on Tuesday, March 25th. So during the SignalGate stuff, Trump. There are two actions from President Trump. One, he issued a pardon, very curious pardon, for Devin Archer, Hunter Biden's business partner. Now, I had just made a report 2 days before on Elon Musk, his new show on X, 69 Minutes on X. I made a report from Ukraine about Devin Archer 2 days before. No one else was talking about this. And then Trump issues a pardon for Devin Archer. And the same day, so Devin Archer was Hunter Biden's business partner with that company Burisma and other things, including involving China. And that same day, Trump declassified the FBI files from Crossfire Hurricane. And both of these are deeply connected to Ukraine and Russia. But there's so one of the main reasons why Americans from middle of America to the White House oppose Ukraine is because they think that Joe Biden was helping Ukraine because of Burisma, because his son made money from Burisma. But as I've seen, I've been here every day of this war reporting, Burisma was a Russian firm, it was a Russian front trying to control Ukraine and get back the regime from before 2014. And actually, as Devin Archer mentioned, which is what I reported on last Sunday on X, in 2023 congressional testimony, Hunter's former business partner, now pardoned last week by President Trump, he said in the testimony it was the day that Putin took Crimea. He was in Moscow meeting with the CEO of Burisma, who had been an oligarch member of the the deep state government that the Ukrainians got rid of in that revolution in 2014. And the optics that I see here is that revolution that Ukraine had is like the Ottawa truckers times a million. If MAGA really saw the reality here, they would be supporting the Ukrainian cause. But it's all been obfuscated and muddled by, I think often with malicious reason, in many ways by Democrats who are simply finding ways to attack Trump and to bring down Trump. Look at the Steele dossier. The Steele dossier started as a Hillary Clinton. The foundation of the Steele dossier initially was an effort to go after the Bidens when Hillary was trying to become president. But then her team shifted focus to use it to attack Trump, and that's where that Burisma stuff first came out. And either they were sloppy and didn't care, the fact that Burisma was not really Ukrainian but actually Russian, or maybe Hillary was somehow in cahoots with the Russians. I think we have to ask this question because they certainly have used Russia a lot to try to clobber President Trump. But Ukraine has been the punching bag so unfairly in this, and now that we see, Devin Archer knows the truth, and so does Hunter Biden if he's able to remember things. I don't know, but they were hired by a member of the government that the Ukrainian people said, get the hell out of our country. We're tired of being controlled by the Kremlin. We're tired of having oligarchs be our... So the CEO of Burisma, before the revolution in 2014, was in charge of minerals. The CEO of Burisma was the Minister of Ecology here in Ukraine, and they got rid of that. And ever since then, Moscow's been trying to find a way to get back. And no wonder the CEO of Burisma hired the son of the United States vice president when he's trying to find a way to take back control in Kyiv. And look, Joe Biden was in charge of Ukraine policy under President Obama, along with his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, in 2014, and did nothing. They did absolutely nothing to stop Russia. And then if you look at, Biden was the one who lifted the sanctions on Nord Stream. He told the American embassy, hey, get out of town. We held on longer in Kabul and Saigon than we did in Kyiv. We left Kyiv weeks before anything happened. It was an invitation. And then if you plot back the past 3 years, every time Ukraine opened an advantage, Biden said no, or he restricted them. And as I look at what the Trump team is saying about Ukraine, I think that the picture of Ukraine they see is a hopeless situation because they're looking at the situation that Biden created. They're not seeing the reality, like all the times when Ukraine actually had an advantage, but Biden restricted them. And so their picture of Ukraine is one created by the incompetent Biden team, and they have not taken the time to actually. And this is why, for example, they don't even know. I know a lot of people in the administration. They are unaware of Ukraine's success in the Black Sea. There's a great piece up today at the Daily Telegraph talking about this. It says, Putin is beaten in the Black Sea. Of course he wants a ceasefire there. Putin is smart. He's very shrewdly getting a ceasefire in the areas where he's the most weak. The Black Sea and energy infrastructure. It's springtime now in Kyiv. So we just finished the third winter of the war. And if you go back and look to all the predictions from last summer and fall, this is supposed to be the worst winter ever. There was going to be no electricity, no water. It would be like Middle Ages. Guess what? We had throughout Ukraine, there was electricity every day. But the absence of a problem doesn't become a headline. So no one's even aware of that. When I talk to people in Washington, they just assume that we're just eating bugs and crawling in the dirt in the dark here in Kyiv, and that's not true.
You will eat the bugs. You will live in the pod.
Well, actually, no. There are people eating dogs, but those are the North Koreans invading Europe from the north. They are eating dogs. But
I want to make sure that Brian
I'll say real quick.
Yeah.
I put the blame also on Zelensky's team is not being shrewd about how they're acting like that Kamala somehow was president. So when they talk to America, they're talking to the wrong America. But at the same time, Trump's team, they could come here and really get a better understanding beyond Zelensky's team of what's really happening on the ground, and they're not doing that.
So, Brian, I see the gears are turning. What do you think about Burisma when it comes to what Joseph says? Is this the revelation? Is this something new?
Okay, so on the Devon Archer thing, well, it makes sense to give him makes total legal sense to give him immunity because then he could testify without having to plead the fifth. That's just the opening shots of a big investigation that's going to take a lot of people down. I will say, I just want to really quickly jump in here and say the Steele dossier, totally agree with you on that, JP. I want to say, like, I do feel like Fuchsia GPS kind of got screwed on that deal. They hired this guy to be their primary source, and he double dealt. And I can speak smartly on that because I know Glenn Simpson. I've done work for Glenn Simpson. I was the guy that served Bill Browder in Aspen. And then all of a sudden, so it's like Glenn Simpson is like, all of a sudden, like, you know, with the Russians, you know, during that deal with Bill Browder, but then with the Steele dossier thing, he's against Russia. I mean, it's just like the whole thing is just crazy. So that said, and I also want to really kind of, you know, give a salute to JP. I don't agree with you on the main thing I don't agree with you on, respectfully, is the importance of Ukraine, which I don't want to get into right now, but we can at another time.
Yeah.
But I do want to really take my hat off to you and give you a hat tip and say you're the first person who's pro-Ukraine war that is actually calling out what needs to be called out in very brutal detail. And I've never heard that before because
Brian, I could be the second if you like.
What's that?
Brian, if you want, I could be the second.
Yeah, please.
I'm happy. I'm happy to. This is why I do these podcasts that Lev kindly puts together and does a really great job of doing.
I think Lev is a troublemaker. I think he puts a bunch of people in the room. And so before you start, Vlad, I want all of you to imagine that we've been buying each other rounds of Guinness or whatever your poison is, and we're just a bunch of fellas having a nice conversation. We're going to disagree and agree, but at the end of the day, nothing's personal.
100%. I could not agree more.
100%. So I want to just. I have so many things to. Add. I could spend 5 hours responding to JP. We don't have 5 hours, and amusing as I am, 5 hours of anybody. So absolutely, Christopher Steele was an issue. I'm not going to say anything about Glenn Simpson because I know for a fact that someone paid him to investigate me, and he has files on me.
Sorry. I'm just.
I know for a fact.
This is the magic.
I believe you, but you gotta understand. Like one thing about DC, I'll say it. I like Glenn. I don't know him super well, but it's like one thing about DC, and I'll give you the mic back in a second. Yes. It's a small place, and so I was running a private detective firm there. Got called by Baker Bots, who then pimped me out to Baker Hostetler, and then that's where I met Glenn. And my first encounter with Glenn is exploring some pretty good dispensaries in Aspen. So the the point, that's why I was laughing, not at what you were saying, but I was laughing when people are like, oh, he's handling Russian assets and creating armies of spies. I'm like, Glenn, I mean, he might be doing.
Glenn was, I mean, look, I signed an NDA, but I mean, the person I signed it with, I hate, so might as well break it.
I'm in an affidavit. That's why I can say this.
So I worked on a documentary series for 2 years, and Glenn Simpson was one of the people that we worked with, and I was, for various reasons, I compartmentalized from him, and I never met him, but he was paid a five-figure sum to investigate me, and he has files on me, and I have a personal animus towards anybody who spent 6 months investigating me and has files on me, and then at the end of it, allegedly,
it wasn't me, by the way, just so you know.
Okay, I'm glad. Allegedly, at the end of it, he said that was very interesting.
One subpoena service. That was it, but yes.
So, anyways, Glenn Simpson and Christopher Steele, absolutely correct. there is a way in which the Ukrainians in general have been very stupid in various things that they've done. And I'm a Ukrainian patriot hardcore, and I've been involved in this. And I was a minor actor in Ukraine Gate and all this. You can Google Ukraine Gate, and I was part of it. And um, Giuliani and Telizhenko and all that stuff. I was there, and I was involved in that stuff. And it is the fact that the Ukrainians have made some very bad bets on the Democratic Party, and it's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone's doing this. Every guy on the panel is like, yeah.
I mean,
I stayed
Yeah.
neutral. I didn't say anything.
JP, you know, Brian
I'm
knows,
fixing my
Lev
mic.
knows.
look, I think a worse bet is the one they're making on the EU and Starmer in the UK right now.
Well, hey,
So what-
if I might, Vlad, interject on. So,
Please.
firstly, I mean, Ukraine is not simply President Zelensky, and I think much more so than
Yes.
other countries, Ukrainians have agency, and this is the part of the story that you don't get from the New York Times. You're not going to get from hearing the government speak. But you see it here, and like one thing I see in Ukraine, whether it's like conservative veterans of Afghanistan or liberal professors from Harvard, they all come here together, and they love this place. And I've been here. I got stuck here in the pandemic. I was traveling the world in 2020, and I was here when everything was shut down, and my flight to Germany was canceled. And I had a hunch that this was going to be one of the freest countries in the world during the pandemic. And guess what? It was. I stayed the entire time. I didn't have to deal with the shots and all that stuff. This was a place
The stinking fog. Sorry.
where you could be free, but it's in the Ukrainian way, which is because partly they learned this through the Soviet times. There were no big protests here. You just do your thing. It's this deep sense of freedom that we can't even imagine in America because we have sort of a lot of disagreement about what freedom means, or we have these past years. And that was not present here. I saw that in the pandemic, and that's why I chose to stay here when the full-scale invasion started, because I said this is a country that actually, more than anywhere else I've ever seen, they have tradition and they have freedom, but also in a tolerant sense. I mean, that in a truly free way.
Right.
And that part of the Ukraine story is never told. You're not going to get it from the legacy media at all. And the sort of MAGA media and conservative podcasts. I think of like Joe Rogan, if he actually knew this reality, he would come and do a week of shows here. I consider Ukraine the world's greatest living self-help book. It's people who, despite stupid decisions from the government, which, by the way, the first 2 months of the full-scale war, the government was in shambles. It was merely the people, like a Cajun Navy of Europe, saying, we're not going to live under Soviet hell again, and defending it. After 3 years, people are tired, and there's a lot of brokenness, but they still hold on. And I think anyone that comes here would deeply feel that. So I think Ukraine is, it is the Texas of Europe to me. It's or Florida of Europe, however you want to call it. And Russia's greatest fear is that MAGA will see this, that MAGA will be fully united with Ukraine. When I look to J.D. Vance's speech in Munich, everything that he spoke about in Munich, all of the virtues that are dead or dying in Europe, and he was right about that. They are
banning samurai swords.
I'm serious.
JP, 100%.
Well, please. Those virtues are thriving in Ukraine because people are actually willing to die for what they believe in. Now, I think if Berlin got invaded, it probably would fall pretty quickly. And part of my role as someone who, as a conservative American who believes in these things, is, I'm kind of a voice in the wilderness when it comes to media stuff because, again, the legacy media will not cover this. Sometimes, I that's a whole other topic for my book afterward, maybe, because I know a lot of those people. But also the conservative podcast world. They'd rather listen to Andrew and Tristan Tate, brothers who live in a fairy princess castle in Romania and talk about being tough, than talk to the Klitschko brothers, world heavyweight champs who are staying here to fight and help. And so we have this this best of times, worst of times confusion of optics. And I think but I understand a lot of it comes from, which if I had never been to Ukraine, I probably would be totally opposed because I started my career working at the Weekly Standard and Fox News, and I got out of there because I was tired of the war machine. And so I was, America, we are traumatized by 20 years of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And one thing I wish that that Zelensky had said in the White House to J.D. Vance, he's like, Washington has lied to all of us. Washington has lied to Americans forever about whether it's, you could say, UFOs, JFK, Iraq, and Washington has lied to Ukrainians. They said, hey, every time Ukraine tried to get more freedom, every time Washington took away more weapons, including Obama and Lugar in 2006, because they don't like, the Henry Kissinger school. They don't like free people. They have to control free people. And this is the same with Europe. And you're right, Brian. Ukraine doesn't have a choice if they don't have America. They have to turn to Europe. And Europe doesn't want a free Ukraine either. They don't want a Ukraine where people won't get vaccinated. They can't tolerate that. And so I see what's going to happen here, especially if they do have to turn totally to Europe. The freedom that you see in Ukraine, which is not a freedom, you don't see that in France or in Germany, it will be lost. I mean, people will keep fighting here, and it's so sad that the people who truly appreciate freedom in America simply can't see this. And that's it. So
yeah, I mean, I think just generally, I think the problem here, for the most part, in the United States, with the way people perceive the war, is that we perceive it entirely through an American lens. Like you said, JP, we're not getting that information from on the ground in Ukraine. We're not hearing that kind of stuff, and I think largely it kind of splits off into partisan land, right? Biden made this a relatively partisan conflict, unfortunately. And I think now the other side of that is going to do the same thing. And I think it's hard for Americans oftentimes to see wars overseas as anything other than how our involvement in it shakes out on political lines, especially in such a polarized time as we live in now. So I think, again, if people here get more information about what's actually happening there, not through necessarily the filters of partisan politics, I could see there being more common ground, but I think that's going to be a tough road to hoe given the last few years.
Well, I think that this is the very first step, Mike, in breaking these echo chambers, because like I said in the beginning, there really is no need for it. The hour is getting late, as that great Jimi Hendrix song all along the Watchtower said. And with that, the timing couldn't be any better, because we have Brandon J. Weichert joining us today, and this is all thanks to Brian. Brian, thank you so much for introducing me to Brandon. And Brandon, you wrote a book, which I got a chance to skim through a little bit. I unfortunately didn't have a chance to read the whole thing yet.
It's all good.
It's called A Disaster of Our Own Making: How the West Lost Ukraine. So Brandon, from hearing JP, I know you came in a little bit late here.
Yeah, sorry, my three kids, I've got a daughter with the flu right now and another one that was just being a 1-year-old, so I had to deal with them. So
no problem at all.
Yeah.
I hope she feels
Oh,
much
they're
better.
all fine. They'll be fine.
That's good.
Just kids being kids.
Yeah. So you heard Joseph talk a little bit about his experiences in Ukraine being like the Texas of Europe. Would you have any disagreements with that, like from the lay of the land you were able to see as far as covering Ukraine? What do you think of that? I think that could be like a good ground for us to start and then build up from.
As it's the Texas of Europe, I mean, I guess that would be an analogy, but I mean, with all due respect, I just, to me, Ukraine is not important. It's really, it's not an essential U.S. national interest. I supported, and I'm sort of just freewheeling here, so I'm sorry. I'm not like, I don't have like prepared.
Go for it.
But I was on with Bannon during this first week of the war. And a friend of mine, Matt Tierman, who's a Polish journalist, he put me on the show, and he was tight with Bannon at the time. And basically, it was like day 3 of the war. And my assumption was that, like everybody, this was going to be, the great Russian, Reconquista. And within a week or 2 weeks, maybe, it quickly became apparent to me that this was not what the Russians were really trying to do. This was not about reconquering the Soviet bloc. This was about creating strategic buffer zones. So this is the old Russian. I see you shaking your head, and that's fine.
Well, we'll get to Vlad soon.
This is the old Russian. This is the old Russian strategic impetus of creating buffer zones between itself and the West. If you remember, throughout Russian history, the Western powers, at least the Russians believe this. This is what the Russians are taught. The Russian empire, the Russian state, has been threatened repeatedly by invasions coming from the European side into the Russian heartland, and so Ukraine is a key avenue historically for invading Russia. And if you are a strategist in the Kremlin, and whatever we think about Putin, he's certainly not my favorite guy. I wouldn't want to, have a glass of vodka with him. But whatever we think of him, he perceives the Russian, existence in that paradigm, and he saw NATO expansion for 30 years. And, you can poo-poo this all you want, but for my book, I found the white papers. I found the strategy documents from the Hudson Institute back in the 90s and early 2000s, and all these other think tanks in Washington, D.C., where they were explicitly outlining the desire on the part of certain multinational firms that were funding these think tanks to bait. And George Soros, this was another big part of his agenda, which is why he was so heavily involved in Europe and in Russia in the 90s. The goal was to collapse the center of the Russian state, break Russia into 3 or 4 smaller countries, and then exploit the 11 to 14 trillion dollars worth of rare earth minerals and natural gas and oil there. And that was the hallucination of Western neoliberals and neoconservatives. Of course, the neoconservative project, going back to the 90s, and even Colin Powell supported this to some degree. The neoconservative project was clearly, and I can empathize, I can sympathize with this desire. After the Cold War, we were the unipolar power. We wanted to keep that going as long as possible. And so part of that agenda was keeping the Russians in the weakest position possible. And I can appreciate that, but we took it too far, because now we're living in a world in which Russia and China are fusing, and in which all the bad guys in America's arsenal of bad guys are congealing. And, we are very much living, unfortunately, in Vladimir Putin's world now, and we do not have a very strong hand. And that's not Donald Trump's fault. It's not even really Biden's fault. That is the fault of the last 30 years of U.S. foreign policy decision-making. Ukraine is not worth a single bone of a U.S. GI. It's not worth a British soldier. It's not worth a French soldier even. It's not even worth a Polish soldier. It is simply not an existential crisis for the United States to risk a protracted direct conflict with the Russian Federation. For the Russians, however, Ukraine being next door, and the fact that the Russians believe, and I think to some degree they're right, that Ukraine was becoming absorbed by NATO, and that the NATO types were going to try to put weapons in Ukraine that could directly threaten the Russian security, national security. I think for the Russians, this is an existential fight. And in fact, the Russians have said that repeatedly in their media, and this is what they're telling their people. And by the way, I speak with the Russians. I speak with Russians pretty regularly now. People in the heartland of Russia, they're actually PO'd that Putin is talking to Trump. They don't want him to talk to Trump. They just want the Russians to just walk all over Ukraine. They don't want a deal because they feel like they've lost too many of their people already in the war, and they want it to mean something. So, this, if we don't get a deal, and I don't know anymore. And Brian, I mentioned this to you last night on your podcast. I actually am very bearish now. I see Trump making the same mistakes his predecessor did. We're shipping more weapons. So we'll see what happens. I don't know if they're going to get a deal. And if they don't get a deal, the Russians, their industrial base is far more efficient. They are going to simply attrite the Ukrainians with or without NATO help in the next probably 12 months if there's no deal. So
I agree.
Vladislav, go
I
for it.
could not agree. I don't agree with a single thing that just came out of his gentleman's mouth. I'm sorry. I mean, no offense intended, but you, sir, are wrong about everything that you just said. I don't even know where to begin. All your assumptions are, let me begin. All your assumptions are absolutely incorrect. First of all, let's start with the assumption, and JP will back me up, that the Russians did not want to regime change Ukraine, that they just wanted buffer space. No, it is fundamentally part of a revanchist, chauvinist, imperialist Russian mentality, which was outlined in Putin's own essay from 2021, that Ukraine is an integral part of the Russian Empire, of the Soviet Union, and of the Russian Federation. This is a 370-year history of Russian imperialism, of which they do not see a Russian Empire without
Let me just clarify.
Wait, no. Brandon, I gotta make sure that Vlad gets to say his piece as well,
but
and
there's
then
been
we
a
break it down.
let him take his point.
Okay.
Brendan, what's your point?
There's been a slight misunderstanding. Let me just clarify one
Okay,
little
sure.
thing, and you can keep going.
Please.
When I talk about buffer zones, I wasn't talking about whether the Ukrainian state would exist or not. I'm just telling you that, and I agree. And I talk about this in my book. Putin
Right.
did write the essay in the New York Times. I acknowledge all of that.
Right.
But the bottom line is this didn't just happen overnight. And so I just want to make it clear. It may be chauvinistic, it may be imperialistic, but from the Russian perspective, that's what I'm saying, is that it's a buffer zone, whether it's an independent country or not. This is a buffer zone thing. It's not about going beyond, but that's my point.
The one thing actually I do, let me just say, the one thing that I do agree with you is that there's been a history of 30 years of mistakes vis-a-vis the Kremlin and Russia relations coming out of Washington D.C., running from the Clinton times to Trump now. Now we probably don't agree on what those mistakes were, but like you, I think that what happened is the outcome of botched political diplomatic relations out of Washington. Too many resets, too many fake disarming security guarantees that meant nothing to the Ukrainians. Allowing the Russians to invade Moldova and then Georgia, and then to become peacekeepers of Azerbaijani and the Armenians, and to allow under Obama, the terrible administration, foreign policy wise, to go into Syria. I think we probably agree on them being terrible. The Washington D.C. consensus ignored the fact that a KGB-run state was running rampant and had restarted the Cold War as early as 2006, certainly by Putin's speech in Munich in 2007, right? So by 2007, anyone who was paying attention to what was going on should have known that the Russians were on the warpath. And I do agree with you, Brendan, that Washington mismanaged Russia, but we probably don't agree what they did wrong. What I don't agree with you on, good sir, is your misunderstanding of the nature of this regime, of the nature of American interests, and of the nature of what it is that NATO can and cannot do against Russia. So this argument that NATO expansion is a problem for Russia.
Oh, there we go. He's coming back. It's a cell phone thing. By the way, I want to remind everybody to smash that subscribe button, smash that like button, click the bell. That is extremely important. I'm using the time right now to shill because it's very important to have these kind of discussions, bring all these people together from all these different circles.
Why are you younglings so violent? Can't I just press the button? Why do I have to smash it?
Well, we got to get the adrenaline going. That's the key here. But JP, while Vlad is stuck in cyberspace right now, any thoughts? Would you like to continue on what he was talking about?
Yeah, well, just responding to Brandon. So, and hello from Kyiv. Firstly, I'll say we talk about NATO expansion. I mean, the most extraordinary and almost unimaginable NATO expansion happened after Russia's full-scale invasion. Finland and Sweden, and very reluctantly, by the way. I spent a lot of time in Sweden. They like their independence, and they really kind of miss it. And so they only did it because they're scared after seeing what's happened here. And I think if you, look at the history of Eastern Europe and, the times of communism, I mean, look at the little Baltic states. They wanted to be in NATO. There was a will among the people to be protected. Ukrainians wanted to be in NATO. And actually, I think if you look, from Washington's perspective, there was a great reluctance to let Ukraine in NATO. Just even look at Joe Biden's statements in 2021. He was always lecturing Ukraine, ironically, on corruption, which Brandon, you missed. But as I reported on Elon's new show on X a week ago. His son was taking money from a Russian company that sort of masqueraded as Ukrainian, that was close to the Kremlin, that was opposed to Ukraine's revolution in 2014. So Biden was, taking money from the Russians, and I think really actually, despite waving the Ukrainian flag, actually not doing a lot to
Yeah, but
help.
I think the problem is that Biden didn't take enough money from the Russians. I think the problem for
I don't know, but I'm saying that
Ukrainians
there are,
gave them more
like,
money, which is why we're
well,
risking
no,
World War
wait,
III.
but Brandon, Ukrainians don't have that much money. I mean, which Ukrainians gave Biden
They've
money?
got a lot of money. They've got a lot of my money. I'm in a very high tax bracket. They've got a lot of my money.
So that's the money. I wanted to talk about the U.S. policy since 1991, but the money things is a separate issue, which maybe we can discuss later. But briefly on that, out of the billions alleged, the valuation,
a lot of money. So
out of the valuation of billions that have allegedly been given to Ukraine under Joe Biden, I think this was something that Biden this is done maliciously. Much of that was a valuation of old American weapons that came to Ukraine, and also new weapons that America would be buying anyway. That in that shitty Washington way, they shove it into the Ukraine bill because they know that they could get away with it. Hopefully, this stuff is being fixed with Doge, but a lot of that money was a mirage, for one. But the main, responding to your point earlier, Brandon, was like when I look at American foreign policy going back to 1991, I see it as very much sort of against free people. Go back to George H.W. Bush, former director of the CIA, his Chicken Kyiv speech. He urged the people of Ukraine to stick with Moscow, and they said, no thanks. We've had that for centuries. We finally have a moment to break free. And you look at the policies of, George W. was appeasing Putin. Obama was appeasing Putin. Remember when Mitt Romney was saying Russia was this great threat, and Obama dismissed it and said, the 1980s called, they want their foreign policy back. And I think we should at least consider whether or not
Russia isn't this great threat to us. They're
well,
not this
okay,
great threat.
maybe.
You should listen to
Not
that.
this great threat. It
Okay,
is the
I'm sorry.
Chinese. It is the
Thank you.
Chinese that are the great threat. Russia is a paltry force. They are bogged down in the muds of Ukraine, and they're winning. But
Brandon, if I might interject as you did, just quickly,
please.
They're bogged down because Ukrainians have fought like hell, because they have got some good tools and kit, because they have amazing drone innovation. And if there had been a Ukraine in Europe like today in 1939, the war would not have gone as far as it did. So, it's hard to look at a counterfactual. But if we are concerned about China, like, we pay attention
just
here.
pushed Russia and China together.
Might I say
That was not
the Chinese are
It's not
allies
an
of
if.
Russia.
We are concerned about China more than anything.
More than anything.
Then I would recommend this course of action. The Chinese are paying close attention at the Ukrainian front lines, especially on current drone warfare, because it is innovating and developing so rapidly and so quickly. And Ukrainians are developing. For example, as we talked about, they destroyed Russia's Black Sea Fleet, a third of it, and they sent the other 2/3 away with drones. And the Chinese are paying attention. I see American defense companies come here, and they think that they, even Anduril, even the innovative ones, they think they have all the solutions. They don't pay attention to how it actually works. They don't talk enough to the frontline guys, and their stuff doesn't work here. So if you want to be ready for China, I don't care. Don't support Ukraine. At least be a friend enough to get some insights on modern warfare, because it is happening here.
Wait, I got to jump in. I'm sorry. They know nothing about combined warfare in Ukraine. Nothing. Okay? They're getting most of their drones from Turkey, who's got side deals going on with China, who also is very slowly and quietly taking control of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Right. And then they're trying to get in bed with the UK, who has maybe 60,000 active duty, maybe
73,000
that can actually fight.
73,000.
Yeah,
and they're talking about conscription. I mean, and JP, I love your research. I do, and it's nice to talk to someone who does the research instead of just speaking from emotions. But to think that anyone can learn anything about warfare from Ukraine because our people, as private contractors, have been deployed to Georgia and Lithuania, where I was just at 2 weeks ago, for the longest time. I got a call from one of my best friends 2 years ago, and he's like, Yeah, man, I'm in a counter artillery unit over here in Georgia training these people how to fight. So if and China paying attention, they lead the world in drone technology.
Yeah, but I think it's also important to remember. So just because I realize not everybody here is familiar with my work.
Love you, JP.
If I completely acknowledge Ukraine has innovative drone tactics. At the same time, the Russians have also innovated the same drone tactics. If you look at the front line, the Russians are now doing the same thing that the Ukrainians are. So it's sort of canceling each other out in some degree.
Wait, Brandon and Brian, can I interject? Because I mean, I would actually, and here's where I wish the administration would actually send people here to actually see the situation, because they could do that. They could do that so easily. And like to say that
got plenty
Ukraine's
of
getting
U.S. military.
Let JP
contracts.
speak right now. We gotta,
to
JP,
say
go
that
on.
Ukraine is getting most of its drones from Turkey is not true. Ukraine, because so the first 6 months of the full-scale invasion, a lot of the stuff came from China, and Ukrainians knew that was dangerous. They knew that you couldn't trust it. And so they began to find ways to make more and more products here in the country. And so and the Russians are innovating, and the Ukrainians are innovating, and that's actually speeding up the innovative process. That's why Iran, we didn't have them tonight, but almost every night we have Iranian drones flying over Kyiv. So those parties are all invested here and paying attention. But I would just encourage, I don't know how else I could convince you, but at least I would encourage people in the Trump team to at least send people here to see it. Because you, in Lithuania and Georgia, you're not going to see the full picture whatsoever. And like the fact that, look at that, the little tiny Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk, back in August, all the experts, the economists and military experts, they said Pokrovsk was going to fall in 2 weeks. And it's still, it's a shambles, but it's still holding on. So the Ukrainians are able to find ways to innovate. It's nasty and it's sad because so many people die, but they are finding ways against the mighty Russian forces. And so much so that Russia had to turn to North Korea.
But I think it's important to keep in mind that there's a limit to that which Ukraine is going to be able to do. There's a limit to that which they can do even with the NATO assistance they've received. I mean, the Russians say this to me all the time when I talk to them in these chat groups. We're taking on all of NATO and we haven't lost our territory in Ukraine. So this is something to consider. Is a peace deal would actually allow for the Ukrainians to hold on to most of what they've got and still prevent many more people from dying. And yet the Zelensky regime does not appear interested in doing a deal. And
No, but that's absolutely
It's not just the Zelensky regime.
and absolutely untrue. First of all, Brendan, just as I was grandiloquently and rhetorically defending the liberal and democracy of Ukraine, my cell phone battery died. So, but that's life.
I thought the Russian
battery
NATO.
died.
That happens. Brendan, I would love to see a peace deal. I was one of those people who said, well, when Trump came to power, maybe he will reverse the slow rolling operations of a Biden administration. Maybe a bad deal before we bleed out is better. Maybe some sort of compromise would be good. All good, practical, pragmatic ideas. I'm not the only one who thinks that way. The problem is that Putin and the Russians have no interest, and they've shown no interest in making such a deal, and they've snubbed Donald Trump over and over and over again in his good faith arguments and diplomacy to make a deal. The Russians do not seem interested in making a deal whatsoever. The Ukrainians have made all sorts of concessions. They were willing to go in for a 30-day peace deal. It's not a regime, first of all. Why not call it the Putin regime, right?
I do. I call in my book. I call it a gangster's paradise.
Good, great. I'm glad to hear it because it's true.
So I'm not pro-Russian. I'm pro-America.
But
Good.
if you're being
Glad
an
to hear
equal
it.
opportunity offender over here regarding Ukraine, because I don't just want to let this slide when you're talking about Ukraine being a regime, what are the specific regime-like qualities? I know this is kind of a tangent, but an important one.
May I answer that? I'd like to explain why I call it that. So I started calling it that last May when Zelensky suspended elections. They've not had elections. They're this great liberal democracy. They don't have elections. He's stayed past his term. And he has indicated, now remember, when he suspended it last year, he said, don't worry, February 2025, I'll reopen elections. February has come and gone. and he has not reopened elections. And it's so bad right now that elements of the Trump administration are having to secretly meet with Petro Poroshenko and Yulia Tymoshenko about restarting elections with or without Zelensky's approval. And the reason that Petro Poroshenko, 2 weeks ago when this news was leaked in Politico,
Yes.
the reason that Petro Poroshenko came out immediately, we want elections, but not until the war is over. This is this great Abraham Lincoln character, Zelensky. Well, we had elections during our civil war. And so there's this great Democrat in Zelensky. The reason that Petro Poroshenko came out and said this is because he doesn't want Zelensky to seek retribution against Petro Poroshenko for meeting with
This is incorrect. First of all, it is incorrect. First of all, and if you think that I don't know about Poroshenko's and Zelensky's problems, please look up my article in Foreign Policy magazine.
I didn't say you didn't. I'm just saying.
I've written a lot about the problems between them, including a month before the war in Foreign Policy magazine. I wrote an article about Zelensky's and Poroshenko's problems, and I said I think the article's name on January 8th was "It's not time for a political retribution." Sir, you just don't understand the constitution of Ukraine. There's martial law. According to the Ukrainian constitution, elections are illegal under martial law.
That is a great democracy.
Well,
Vlad, the Constitution was written.
If I might interject. So
Please,
I would say
on.
most Ukrainians would love to have an election. Most Ukrainians would like to have a different president.
Like most depressed people.
Actually. But
who's the president?
but they also, but if I might, most Ukrainians also know that you can't do that right now under the current situation. And here's one very practical reason. After this war, when there is some kind of victory, most Ukrainians are, as they were in 2014, they were sick. The reason why they voted for a comedian is because they were sick of the oligarchs, right? Even if the comedian was controlled by an oligarch. But most Ukrainians now would want to have a class of new leaders who are war heroes, who are the veterans, just like America would. And if you have elections now, you're going to get the same old fat shits like Poroshenko and others. They're sick of that. And that you can't have soldiers still in the trenches be campaigning.
Wait.
So
I'm sorry. Just like America.
This is an actual reason.
What is your?
It's an actual reason.
That's what America.
I mean, can I just pop in too about the whole Civil War idea?
Okay. Real quick, Mike Cote on the Civil War. Then we're going to go back to JP. Mike Cote, go for it.
I mean, just a brief point about that. It was much easier for the North to hold elections during the Civil War because New York City wasn't being shelled every day.
Thank you, Mike.
It's a lot easier to hold elections when you're not actually under physical invasion threat all the time. And I think that's a major, major difference between American elections during the Civil War and Ukrainian non-elections now. Is that, yes, the South split off, and that was its own territory at the time of the Civil War, but they didn't make huge inroads into the major population centers of the North, at least at the time of the election in 1864. So I think there's a huge, huge difference there, and I think that's a point that really kind of is made all the time, but isn't really correct.
For Americans too.
What'd you say?
Look,
I just want to point
Brendan,
out that the South
Mike,
were
that's-
Americans too.
Oh, they
Mike,
were.
You're
and they were
absolutely right,
rebels.
Brendan. I just want to say this. It is against the Constitution of Ukraine, which was written 30 years before this war started. It would require a constitutional convention. It would require the parliament voting on a electoral law, and there's actually a 6-month cool-off period between the two votes that would be required to change the constitution. Then it would require 3 months of study for the bill, 3 months to implement it, and 3 months to organize an election. It would take 9 months to a year to create an election. It would require creating a tremendous amount of consulates because there are 10 million Ukrainian citizens outside the country. Technically, it is remarkably difficult to have this, and it's also against Ukrainian law. You understand this?
I will just like to also add then to that this is an insane conversation because the Russians that I talk to say the same thing about their constitution. We can't do a deal because it's in our constitution that the territory we've acquired is now part of the Russian Federation. And so I guess we're at an impasse then. And my solution, and I have said this to people in the administration, is to call Zelensky and Putin and say, we're cutting off all aid and America's pulling out, and let you two figure it out.
No.
Because this
But
doesn't
why
work.
are you only putting pressure on Ukraine as opposed to
We're
only
not putting
pressure
pressure on you. We just Trump just authorized a massive military aid package again to the Ukrainians. He just did this. So my
Brandon,
point is,
Brandon,
hold on,
why
hold on.
doesn't
Let me
guy
just-
like you
let me
just
just-
ask-
let me
Wait,
just say
wait,
this.
wait,
Let me
one at a
just say
time.
this.
Okay,
Let me just
Brandon,
say
then
this.
Vlad.
The Russians have been consistent in one point, and this is something that even Susan Rice acknowledged, and I know Susan Rice. This is something that even she acknowledged.
Yes.
Is that the Russians have consistently said, even before the war, weapons into Ukraine that the NATO types were giving, that is the problem. That's what they want to stop as a beginning point for a deal. And that is the one thing the Trump administration now will not do. They won't do it. They won't even contemplate.
Why do the Russians get to say that to Ukraine?
Because
in
the
first
Russians are
place?
winning. The Russians are
No, but
winning. That's why
they're
winning.
not winning very much. First of all, after
they're
3
winning.
years,
But
they're not
winning.
winning.
But
They're not
they're
winning
winning.
very. Stop it! This is so childish, my man.
It's
Why
not
don't you ask?
childish. It's not childish. This is a
It is.
fact,
It is.
and you want
it
to
is
glaze
childish
over this
rhetoric,
fact.
man.
Wait,
It's
wait,
childish
everybody,
rhetoric.
hold on, everybody,
Yes.
please. Let's go back. Brandon, I'm going to be a bit of a pit bull about the previous thing that was talked about regarding the elections. I do not want to let that go. So, Brandon, imagine you are now a senior official in the Ukrainian government. People put you into that position. They disregarded all these Russian people you talk with, said, no, Brandon's a good guy. We're going to make you in charge. And now Vladislav goes to you as an advisor and tells you, Brandon, I know we really, really want to do these elections, but we can't because of all of these things. Brandon, you being in charge of Ukraine now, how do you fix this? How do you make sure that you have these elections based on all this stuff that Vladislav was talking about? Do you just like cut the Gordian knot? And if so, how would you technically do it?
Well, I think the first thing to do, and this is a hypothetical, and I think the first thing to do is you need to stop the bleeding. And so, yeah, if you need to cut the Gordian knot, then that's what you're going to need to do, because the alternative is you're going to lose your country. You're going to lose your country.
Meaning, so not following the law as far as how the elections are supposed to be conducted.
You're talking about saving your country. And it's very funny how it's like it's pick and choose, because I remember, what was it, right before the war began, the Russians went ape over the fact that the Ukrainians changed their constitution, requiring them to reclaim Crimea. That was a constitutional change that was made to the Ukrainian constitution, so that was no problem for Ukraine to do.
That was voted in.
No.
That was voted in.
Right. Great. So vote in an end of the war. Most Ukrainians, and I do know quite a bit of Ukrainians, I talk to a lot of people because that's what I do for a living. A lot of Ukrainians I speak to are no longer supportive of Zelensky.
Yeah,
they're very supportive. They're very supportive of Trump's peace initiative. And yet I keep being told can't have peace because it's in the Constitution.
Wait,
No,
Brandon,
like
that means, wait, Vlad, hold on one second.
Peace, man.
Wait, Brandon. What you're saying, though, is that you would have to assume some kind of a dictatorial power over Ukraine in order to tie this Gordian knot and allow for the elections to happen.
They've created a dictatorship. They've already created. What does it matter? They've already created a dictatorship. The whole thing.
So if we break it down, elections. Vlad is talking about how there's all of this red tape, all these laws that are in place. So let's leave that aside. What are the other aspects that you see this being a tyrannical regime?
Well, I mean, they're forcibly conscripting people. This is not a popular war. This is not something that a majority of people in Ukraine are all gung-ho about anymore. They could have had a deal. That's not incorrect.
That's not what the polling says.
They could have had a deal in 2022 to end the
Also
war.
incorrect.
No, it is not incorrect.
They could have had
absolutely not incorrect.
Excuse me.
This
They
is
could
not
have.
even worth
That is
having
wrong. They could have had.
One at a time.
They could have had a deal to disarm the country.
2022, the Istanbul Conference came out, and they wanted to, and Zelensky was open to it, and then Kuleba got on the phone, because Kuleba's a nut job. Kuleba got on the phone with the British, and Boris Johnson and Joe Biden, or whoever was running the White House, conspiracy theory. It's not a conspiracy theory.
It's a conspiracy
Boris Johnson and Joe Biden, or whoever was running the White House for Joe Biden that day, decided to pressure Zelensky and told him to stop the deal. And they did. And they did.
you-
And
I'm sorry,
now
I want to
the
get in here real
Iranians have
quick.
died
Vlad, I'm
en
sorry.
masse.
I got to get in here because this is something that I was looking at. When it comes to Alexei Arestovich, who I'm sure you guys are familiar with, he was working under Zelensky. He was there for the conference. Now, according to him, and he put out the list, the condition was a maximum of 45,000 armed forces for
Thank you.
peacetime in Ukraine. And he said, and this is not, by the way, what he said to, the gullible Western media. This is something that he said, to the Russian-speaking media, like Michael Fagan. He said that he fell out of his chair laughing at the condition that the Russian delegation presented here. So again, all of this goes to the question of, will Russia go beyond Ukraine into Poland, into the Baltics, like their generals are talking about, like Putin's propaganda people are talking about? Bren, I'm just curious, why wouldn't Russia
Vlad,
go? Why
before we
wouldn't
go-
Russia proceed?
Vlad,
Yes.
Lev, before we go on, Vlad, I gotta say, look, I invited my friend on here.
Yes.
We've been respectful to each other. Trumping someone with conspiracy theory, like you've been doing, I would ask you to pull back and let's
the
keep
Boris
this,
John- the
no,
point about
let's
Boris
keep this
Johnson is a conspiracy
respectful
theory.
because
That's
again,
okay.
we're
I
trying
get
to
it.
learn from each other. Again, this is-
yes,
we are.
It's not a
He took the
conspiracy
time to
theory.
come on here.
Yeah, I'm happy to have. I came on here also. I have other things I could be doing. I'm happy to have a honest conversation.
Well, I
the
am
point-
having an honest conversation. I'm
I'm
having an honest
having a
conversation.
respectful, honest conversation, Brian.
I am.
Thank you so much. The point about Boris Johnson nuking the talks is a conspiracy theory.
No,
point.
it's not.
The fact.
It's not.
Prove it.
How do we
Where's the
disagree?
source?
Brian, let me say, I agree with
you're
Brian.
welcome.
Like,
Let me
let's
just
not use
defend
term
myself.
conspiracy theory. Let's discuss.
Let
the
me just
fact
defend
that
myself
that's
here.
used by people when they don't.
Yeah,
have an
Brendan,
argument.
Brendan,
It's not
Brendan, you got
just
the
a-
floor.
Let me just
Brandon's
defend
got the
myself
floor.
here.
Thank you,
I wrote a very well sourced book. The sources are in the footnotes and in the back of the book, and you are welcome to look for them, and you are welcome to critique me based on that.
Yes.
But please do not sit here and tell me that I'm a conspiracy theorist when I am not. I am not a conspiracy theorist. And so, that's fine. The Ukrainians want to yell conspiracy theorist and Russian propaganda whenever they don't like anything. And that's your right. That's fine. But at the end of the day, my original point still stands. Ukraine is not worth what we have committed to it. It is not. And it never will be. It never will be. The American people will never care about Ukraine the way the Russians are obsessed with Ukraine. It's never
Well,
gonna happen.
that is true that the Russians care much more about than the average American does. But the average American doesn't care about Venezuela either or Australia.
That's
that
not
much
true.
either.
Well,
That's completely
No,
wrong.
guys, if I
You're
could, I'm gonna have to
completely
go in a few minutes because it's 3:00 here in Kyiv.
Yeah,
and
go
I'm
for it,
tired.
JP.
And it's a quiet night. I can actually sleep right now without without drones on my head, and so I'm trying to get some
Yes.
rest. But look, whether or not you choose to support Ukraine is one thing, but I think it's important to try to have a command of the reality. That's why I'm a reporter. That's why I reported every single day. I never took a day off on Chicago's WGN radio from 2022 to 2024 until some asshole canceled it to tell the real story of the war as I saw it.
Yes.
And firstly, my sense of the Ukrainians that throughout this country, if Zelensky surrendered, if he ever tried to surrender, there would be a new president. They'd kick him out, constitution or not. He's gone. They'd have another Maidan. That still is a reality. And as I travel the country, when I'm in the West, like Western Ukraine, there is more. The further away you are from the war, everyone's affected. Everyone's got friends at the front. In Lviv, you have lots of guys missing arms and legs. They go there to recuperate. But Lviv is a calm, safer city, pretty much. And you find more willingness to negotiate and make some kind of deal in Lviv than you do in a city like Kharkiv, which is 30 miles from Russia. I go to Kharkiv all the time because it's a capital of defiance. Now, you might say it's insane. Maybe America doesn't have to support it. At least something to respect, like Sparta. But that is the reality there.
Yeah.
Go
I
to a place like
didn't
Kharkiv.
say I didn't respect
no,
the Ukraine.
no.
Yeah, and
Brandon,
JP, I gotta say this.
I'm not
but I
questioning
want to
respect.
jump in
Wait.
before JP leaves. JP, I don't think there's an American MAGA or otherwise that doesn't respect the Ukrainian and the Russian fighters on the ground, because most MAGA are veterans, myself included. I've worked with Spetsnaz. I've worked with Ukraine. I've worked with so many countries over there. The other thing is this premise, like we can get America to care. We got the affected areas of North Carolina that Helene tore up on fire right now. Okay, we have people literally on the streets losing their land. We cannot afford to care because Americans have been neglected for the last 4, if not 10 to 15 years. We can't afford it. Brendan just said earlier, like, hey, I paid my taxes. I know how much it costs. The average person who has a W-2 that works, and sorry, I'm loud, but I'm not mad at you, JP. But the average, I'm just Irish. But the average,
so is it. My mom is O'Shea, so I'm Irish.
Oh, your mom's O'Shea?
Yes.
Oh wow. Anyway, we'll connect.
You guys are relatives.
That's the house of the little people, by the way. But the thing is, I hear this all the time. And look, I think it's very easy to, especially being in Ukraine, to say, why don't they care about this? Why don't they care about this? When I was in intelligence organizations, I'd be like, why don't they care about this? Why don't they care about this? But people can't afford to gas up their cars. It's getting better, but they can't afford it. And at the same time, think about how many people lost their jobs because they wouldn't get an experimental mRNA jab. So they're not thinking about Ukraine. They're not thinking even about Yemen. What they're thinking about is, how the hell am I going to get food on the table? And how the hell am I going to get to work if I can even get that job, which is only going to last for 3 days? And how the hell am I going to pay for my kid's hospital bills who just got his ass kicked by some kid in high school because no one's doing their job? So it's not a question of like, MAGA disrespects Ukraine and we don't care and we like Putin. No, we're
Zelensky
surviving.
was the disrespectful one in the Oval Office.
And I agree
Brian,
with that.
Well, I agree with you on this. So I think there's two separate issues here. One is being accurate about the actual mentality here. So, Brandon, from my experience here in Ukraine, I'd say your picture of the Ukrainian mentality is not what I see here. That's one thing. Now, it's a totally separate question to say, should America support this? And that's a different question, which we should discuss later. What I can provide is I can tell you my sense of what reality is here. I see a lot of strengths. I see people that are refusing to surrender. I see a lot of great technological developments in which America could benefit. And I see, for example, I wish Doge would come here and take a look, because we see the Pentagon waste, fraud, and abuse on full display here. We see all the stuff that doesn't work. And so I would just say on that level, it's at least interesting. And I wish that we could get past some of the partisan stuff in America. I mean, Joe Biden, he almost did everything he could to make Americans hate Ukraine. When those hurricanes were happening, in my home state of North Carolina, for example, is when Joe Biden chose to release $8 billion in funding for Ukraine. Now, our stupid media, no one reported this accurately. That was not new money. That had been approved by Congress, by Mike Johnson in April. And Joe Biden was just slow in sending it. And so, but all the headlines made those poor Americans beleaguered by the hurricanes and all the other bullshit, made them think, oh, another $8 billion. It wasn't. So it already was a lot, but Joe Biden almost was trying to make them hate Ukraine. It was horrible the way they did it. And on top of that, it wasn't $8 billion in cash. A lot of that was evaluation of old weapons that came here and money to buy new weapons produced in the United States.
It doesn't matter because it left the U.S. It left the American taxpayer.
Most of it stayed.
It burdened them.
Well, but most of it did stay in the U.S. and we've never. But I think the media has done.
Burdened the taxpayer. It might have stayed in the U.S., but it probably stayed in Upper Manhattan. But the point is,
that's not where they build weapon systems.
It's what's that?
They don't build weapon systems in Northern Manhattan. As someone who used to live there.
Yes, they do. They're called venture capitalists and hedge funds.
They're not in Northern Manhattan, though. They're in Southern Manhattan.
I'm a big enemy of those guys.
Dude, I lived in the West Village.
They usually live in Connecticut.
Oh, Joseph, I know you got to go right now.
Ridgecrest.
I want to make sure that final messages, anywhere people could find you. Where should we follow you?
Oh, I forgot. There's people watching. You can follow me at JP Lindsley on X and Instagram. And our website, howaboutfreedom.com, where I have all of my daily reports going back to February 24th, 2022. At least it's an archive of what it's been like to be in war here every single day. Again, at JP Lindsley on X and on Instagram. And thanks to all of you guys, Brandon, Vlad,
nice
Brian. Maybe
Thanks.
Brian, maybe
Nice
we're
meeting you.
cousins. I don't know. My family's from County Kerry.
JP, go ahead
Mike
and DM me.
and
We'll connect
Lev.
offline.
Indeed.
Excellent.
All right, guys. Thank you from Kiev. Good night, good morning, whatever.
Good
And,
night,
thank you for the
and good morning.
I'll
conversation.
see you in a
Cheers.
month. I'll see Joseph. I'll see you in a month. I'll be there in a month.
Indeed. See you guys.
Okay.
And guys, be sure to like, subscribe, and all that. Now, I want to make sure, Brandon, I hope that you could stick around
smash.
for a little bit. And smash. I want to make sure you could stick around for a little bit because I want to go real deep on the Boris Johnson stuff because that is very important that we be very detailed
It's
and
not
nice
that
and neat
important, man.
about it. Well, no, just because it was mentioned. So if it was mentioned, if there was this big brouhaha
Yeah.
about it, I want to get a little bit into it. So in your book, you wrote, in the beginning, you wrote, the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett revealed how he was attempting to broker a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. Bennett claims that both Zelensky and Putin were ready to meet in Turkey and finalize a much-needed end to the war. Unfortunately for everyone, certain powerful members of NATO were simply too committed to the Ukraine war to have it end soon. And the article that you put up over here is from AP, former Israeli PM, Putin promised not to kill Zelensky. This is February 5, 2023. So we can get into that as well. But continuing on with Boris, to stop the unwanted peace deal from happening, Britain's leader, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, boarded a plane and in his signature scruffy style appeared in Kiev. Ostensibly, he was there to show support for the Ukrainian cause, to rally the troops, as it were. Unofficially, however, Johnson was there to remind Zelensky that he was merely a passive observer in this war. Sure, it was Zelensky's people who were being slaughtered en masse and his country that was being ripped apart by the war, but there were larger concerns for Britain and its primary ally, the US. A pressure campaign conducted by the British and American governments ensured that the Ukrainians would not negotiate from their position of relative strength. The war would grind on. All that leverage Zelensky had acquired by presiding over the successful defense of Kiev was gone. 2 years after the start of the war, it was now the Russians who are in positions of strength and the Ukrainians who are at the breaking point. Here's the kicker to the whole story. The Russians claim the only reason they pulled their army back from Kiev in April 22 was because Moscow was given certain guarantees by the West that negotiations for a peaceful settlement to the conflict would take place. Once the Russians pulled their forces back from Kiev, however, the West reneged on their promises and the war continued on. This claim was made by Vladimir Putin in his interview with American journalist Tucker Carlson in early February 2024. Many in the West challenged Putin's assertion. It should be noted, however, that my colleague Lee Slusher, a former U.S. intel analyst with experience in Russia, believes that this is true. The Russians, according to Slusher, did pull back as part of a larger movement towards peace that the NATO side ultimately broke and likely never had any intention of respecting. So when it comes to the evidence that we have from here, what can we glean from this? So Vlad, based on what was talked about here, any thoughts? Yes.
So let me respond to all that. So the stuff about Naftali Bennett negotiating between the Russians and the Ukrainians in order to promise that Putin would stop sending hit squads against Zelensky. That's true, and Bennett has said that in the room that I was outside the room, but I was in the same building. I was in the next room. He said this to two friends of mine also. So I've heard this from other people, and he said this to various people, and this was in the news. That part of it is verifiable. The part about the part about what happened in negotiations in Turkey, there are different vantage points of what happened there, and I know it from the Ukrainian side. And this isn't about Foreign Minister Kuleba, who was executing policy. That's not the case, and it wasn't about the British wanting to keep the war going. In fact, they didn't. It was entirely about two or three things. One of those was that the Ukrainians found a bunch of bodies in Bucha after they took it back, and at that point there was 97% of a population wanted to keep fighting. Two, what was offered by the Russian delegation in Turkey was unilateral disarmament. Lev has actually used the numbers. That was completely a non-starter. So they were much further away from a deal than that account Brandon writes makes apparent. Three, the Russians had no intention of stopping the war. They were interested in, in negotiating and having the Ukrainians take major concessions to stop fighting. But the kinds of concessions the Russians intended to give up were so much that the Ukrainians could never do that and retain have the population not overthrow the Bankova, which is where the presidential administration is. So it is the fact that there were negotiations. I don't think, in my personal interactions with former Prime Minister Johnson, I don't think he wanted to keep the war going. I don't think he really cares about anything except a general. I was in a command car with a commanding general of a Southern Front in the summer of 22, and he's like, "What is? Can I ask you a personal question?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Boris Johnson, is he really on our side?" I said, Mr. General, he only cares about two things: girls and political power, right? And the general said, "Well, that's kind of great. I like girls too." So, Boris Johnson was not himself personally interested in keeping the war going. That is the conspiracy theory, as I said, Brandon, that there were negotiations. I did not mean that you're wrong about that. That happened. And we have differing accounts of what they came to, but I don't mean
Well,
you're a conspiracy theorist. I
okay.
think the point about Boris Johnson is a
Well,
kind of meme.
what
That's what I
what
meant.
well, what I was saying was Boris Johnson as the head of government was operating in that way. And
Right.
so whether Boris Johnson, whatever his, I don't know what his, what's inside Boris Johnson. I can just tell you the actions, and in the context of those actions, what the perception is. And I back up the data in my book. So, we may disagree, I guess, on the perception of the event, but the event occurred. And since we're sharing professional stories,
Mhm.
I am also a subject matter expert for the U.S. Air Force.
Okay.
And when
Thank you
I
for your
was
service.
no, I'm not military. I'm just a
Okay.
consultant, civilian.
All
But
right.
thank Brian for the service. Brian was the
Brian,
one.
thank
Thank
you
you
for
for
your
your service,
service.
Brian.
But just so everybody understands, I'm not just some guy in the in the living room writing. I am in my living room right now, but I I bring this up because at the start of the war,
Yeah.
I was at an undisclosed location out west in the United States,
Okay.
and I was having a very similar conversation that I'm having with you, Vladislav, where the
Yes.
two-star general there wanted to get in my face about how much of a effing moron I was, and how Mr. Weichert doesn't seem to get it. And he explained to me quite loudly, "Don't you understand, Mr. Weichert?" I said, "What's that?" He said, "We're bleeding the Russian army in the field for nothing." And I said, "Well, General, it looks to me like we're bleeding it for all the young men in Ukraine, and I'm not really sure what we're getting." And that is the strategic mindset. And I don't think it's quite strategic when you actually look at the whole diagram here, or the whole map. The strategic interest of the US, and by extension, the UK, and the rest of Europe, which is to try to bleed the Russian army in the field. And it, you know what? I'm just going to be a nice guy here and say maybe in the beginning that is what was going on in 2022, but today that is not the case. It is the Ukrainians who are overextended. It is the Ukrainians who are hanging on by a thin nail, and that is why we need a peace settlement, because otherwise the Russians are going to break through. The Russians' defense. And this is Mark Rutte, my old friend Mark Rutte, who I knew once upon a time when I was involved with, Mark Rutte came out and said very recently, I think in the last month,
Yes.
that the Russian Federation's, which I was saying in 2023, and I was canceled for saying this, the Russian defense industrial base is producing now in 3 months what it takes the NATO defense industrial base a year to produce. You can't win a war that way. You can't win a
That's
war
true.
that
We can for various other reasons. The counter arguments to what you just said are this. One, I've myself in my moments of weakness have said that we're bleeding the Russians dry for pennies on the dollar. And I've said that to people that needed to hear that argument, and I don't believe in that. I don't think we should be thinking like that. But we also begged and blustered and asked the Russians not to start this war. People who use the words proxy conflict aren't technically wrong. It is a proxy conflict, but it's one that we begged the Russians not to start. But now that we're begging them, that we're begging them to end it, sadly, I would love. I mean, I know so many people who've died. I mean, my ex-wife. I'm divorcing my first Ukrainian wife. Not that I'm gonna have more Ukrainian wives, but I'm divorcing my wife. My wife has 15 girlfriends who lost their husbands on the front lines. The casualties are horrific. I know lots of people who've died, and it's terrible. And these are my friends, and I evacuated my family, and it's terrible. And I wish that wasn't the case. But the people who don't want to negotiate at this point are sadly the Russians. And
I think just
wish
jumping
Donald
in here
Trump
for
the
a
best of
second.
luck.
Sure.
Honestly,
yes, Mike.
I think the big thing is everyone here, I think, agrees on the fact that it would be better to have a peace deal than not as of now.
Right.
I think the issue is that what are the terms of that deal? Is it durable? Is this going to be something like 2014 where the war can get started up again in 8 years?
That's exactly what the Russians have been saying. We don't want to just do a ceasefire because this is going to be Munich all over again, or Munich, the Munich,
Minsk 1 and 2.
I guess what the problem is there is that the solution that they think here is basically denuding Ukraine of all of its defenses. So I think that is something that's a non-starter I think that's a non-starter for Ukraine, rightfully so. I can understand having all of Ukraine territorially intact again, including Crimea, is a non-starter for Russia. I just think the problem here is that we tend to be leaning more towards Russia's non-starters entirely than Ukraine's. And I think that if we want to be any sort of negotiator in terms of getting a durable peace, we need to find that middle ground. And I don't think right now that's the approach that we have.
I just would like to
look. I just want to reiterate Brandon's point from earlier. They're losing. And I hate to quote, steal someone else's quote, but they don't have any cards without the U.S. So they have to accept it because either way, you mentioned, and respectfully, Mike, you mentioned that, it's going to denigrate their defenses. So is total defeat and annihilation. They won't have a country.
Earlier, with the JP.
I guess what I would say to that is that, I mean, they may have fewer cards without the United States, but we don't need to necessarily pull those cards away from them for no reason. And I don't think we really get much out of that.
Well, yes, we do, because if we get more entrenched in Ukraine, then, everyone's talking about like, oh, China's going to see us pulling out as weak, and then they're going to attack Taiwan. No, China wants us there.
Yeah.
China wants us there so that we can't defend our real interests. And I agree with Brandon. Strategically and grand strategy wise, they're not of any strategic value.
Venezuela is more important
to the United States. Absolutely.
Period.
I don't agree with that.
I mean, Russia, Venezuela,
and Vlad, I mean this respectfully,
working together.
Actually, I'd like to ask all of you, why does Ukraine matter? And it's not argumentative. I do, because I hear a lot of people saying, oh, it matters, but no one ever tells me why.
Vlad, you were talking
Vlad
about
probably
this
has a
before.
stronger answer than I do on this, but just briefly,
Please, why are they?
Mike, no,
why does the United
please.
States, not Europe? I don't care about them. I care about the United States. Why are they of strategic value, defensively or otherwise, to the United States? Ukraine.
It's not necessarily that point.
Go ahead, Mike. Please.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that making sure there is a world where there is not major interstate conflict for territorial expansion is a major U.S. interest, regardless of whether that happens to be in Eastern Europe or in the South China Sea or in the Middle East. And I think that's something that we take our eye off the ball and we lose a lot more than we bargained for.
So why'd we let Hong Kong happen?
That was a disaster. I don't think we should have done that. I think that was bad.
Okay.
You think we should have gone to war over that?
Over Hong Kong? No, that wasn't our job. I think the British should have seriously considered doing something about that.
But why are we letting NATO expand? Why'd we
because
go
the
back
countries that decide that they want to be
expand? But that's expansion.
Remember your Frederick the Great. Ye who defends everything defends nothing. NATO is now so large it is completely unmanageable. It is ineffective. It is combat ineffective. It is a Potemkin force, and frankly, it no longer serves America's interest. America's interest right now is trying to neutralize the Russian-Chinese alliance, and that is never going to be done as long as the insuperable wound that is Ukraine continues to bleed out.
I totally agree.
I just don't think that's going to happen, period.
Guys, I don't think that's going to happen, period.
I don't think it's going to happen, but I don't agree with Brandon's
axis splitting. I just don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah.
The Soviet split in the 1970s was entirely something that existed previously to the Kissinger and Nixon approach. And I think that we're in a very different situation now.
Neutralize, as in I'm not saying necessarily we can flip Russia to Team America, but I believe we can certainly induce them to not be as integrated into this new Chinese empire. I do believe that.
You mean splitting?
Splitting.
I just don't think that's going to happen.
I think it's very possible, and I think it can happen.
And I think that's
Putin-
obviously
if
one of the
Putin
major core
dies-
disagreements.
If Putin dies, then maybe that is possible. As long as Putin and all of his KGB buddies are around, I think that they are too tied at the emotional hip as far as how they consider China to be. I think they look at a lot of Americans as being naive, good-hearted people who they can take advantage of and
I
aren't
think
scared
Russia
of.
cares about Russia.
No, they
Well, I
don't.
think they share the goal with
Russian
China of
leadership doesn't give
undermining
a
American hegemony, or at least primacy.
Russian leadership doesn't give a rat's ass about the Russian people. It
No, I'm
treats
not saying
Russia
that, but
itself
what
as a
it doesn't
glorified
matter
gas
what they care
station.
about. What I'm saying is they don't care about like what the world thinks about them. They care about Russia. They are truly a nationalist country. And you know, for me, it's like that's something I can work with. And they want to make money. And guess what? They're making money off the European Union and the United States since we stopped drilling because we became the third largest natural gas customer. And if the Europeans cared so much, you know, yes, they've done some, you know, kind of performative reductions of dependence on Russia, but they're not. They're not stopping.
100%.
They're trying,
Yeah.
Brian. They're trying. They should
Yeah.
do more, but they should do more, as you say.
They're
but
trying. How are
they're
they
trying.
trying?
They're building LNG platforms and all this. I mean,
They're building
you're right.
LNG platforms
Look,
now.
the time for that was 20 years ago. It's
I agree
game
with you
over
guys.
now for Europe.
I agree
We're
with you
moving
guys.
on.
No, but
Moving on.
Brandon, here's the problem.
We
Though.
agree on this.
What you're saying right now, and the general thought from the people who are again supporting Ukraine, it reminds me of a little quote from Lord of the Rings, from the great Saruman the White. Did you not seriously think that a hobbit could contend with the will of Sauron? There are none who can. Against the power of Mordor, there can be no victory. We must join with Gandalf. We must join with Sauron.
Ooh.
I love Lord of the Rings. Have you just been waiting to use that quote? Because I don't. Can you just explain the applicability?
Absolutely,
of it?
yeah.
Can you not use the white? I find that very racist.
Sauron was this great wizard. He was like the most powerful of the
Oh, I know,
wizards,
I know,
and he
yeah.
decided to
He knows.
join up
I think Brian
with the
knows.
dark.
He knows.
Yes, with the Dark Lord Sauron, because he doesn't think that there could be any victory against Sauron. So you might as well just, put up your butt, allow for a good spanking, to get that over with, and hope for the best that Daddy Putin is going to take it easy on Ukraine and the rest of Europe.
I listen. I don't think you understand. I have dealt with this part of the world for a while. My time in government, I know exactly what the Russians are going to do and how they're going to do it. And I'm just telling you, this isn't about becoming Putin's, mistress. This is about cutting our losses so we can marshal our forces and stand up America, because right now, as Brian was talking about earlier, America's not doing well. We are very
We all agree,
unwell.
gents. We all agree that America needs to focus on its own problems, also. But I'd like to answer Brian's question in this way. I think, sir, for a gentleman with a noble name of Irish O'Shea, you should
I'm
be more
always worried when you say something nice up front.
Yeah,
I
you should
lived
be.
in DC for a long time.
I despise DC. I hate DC. There's nothing I
That's
hate more.
terrible.
That's
We
terrible
agree
town.
on that for sure.
Yeah, we
Despise
can
it.
agree on that.
I spend as little time there as possible. It's a despicable town. Uniquely charmless. I hate it. But look, Brian, you're a gent,
Glad.
but you should be more considerate. You should be more considerate of your European heritage. Your European.
Why?
Because
Why?
Europe is. I mean,
I'm a
look,
nationalist populist. Why?
world.
Why do I care?
I'm not a populist. I'm an American nationalist. But I mean, I care about
I'm
Europe
definitely-
because I'm from there. One.
No, I care, but I care about America first.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but
That's
in
the
a way
thing,
that.
and
Yes,
I
go
don't
ahead.
have time or as America, I
Right.
don't have time, money, or resources to keep caring as much as the Biden administration cared. So I guess what I'm saying is I hear you. I'm not look, I'm not a freaking ghoul. I care about. I'm going back to Europe next week. It's like all of my friends are over there. We spend a lot of time there. I
Good.
spoke at Students for Liberty on 7 different country tour.
Right.
It's like all across Eastern Europe and Russia. Okay.
Right.
And I've friends everywhere for the last 30 years. So I care, but I also care more about our own country. And until that's fixed, until America is fixed, Brandon said it right. Look what happened to the world the minute, like within months, of America being horribly, wittingly or unwittingly, I lean towards wittingly, mismanaged, and
It
just
has been mismanaged. America's been mismanaged for 25 years.
agree there.
depleted by design. We won't get into the CCP, unrestricted warfare, grand strategy, China dream. It's definitely related. But what I am saying is,
Yes.
I can't, like, for instance, okay, real quick anecdote. Lev,
Yeah.
I know your body language, so I will
You're
land
good.
a plane.
You're
And I
good.
say you're looking more like Jesus every time I come on this podcast.
He looks
which is a
great.
compliment.
Yeah, hopefully I don't end like Jesus, with the way things are going with the show.
You don't
It
want to
worked
go
out for
back.
me.
Yeah.
You don't wanna
But
come back
anyways, I'll make it quick. I had a brother-in-law who I couldn't stand. He left.
No,
Anyways,
he's around. He's
okay.
around. He's just
Me,
I
no,
had
I'm
a
here. I'm here.
brother-in-law who I
No, I'm
couldn't
just-
stand. He was.
No, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Oh no, that's okay. I thought you left.
No, I'm here. I'm here. I just got to tell this
I
guy
hear
that
you.
I'll be
You're
here in
just-
20 minutes.
I gotcha. I shut mine off too. But
I'm here,
his
I'm
life
here.
was a mess. His life was a mess. Like, he was an alcoholic. Everything. I was glad
Yes.
he's gone. But he bought this land in like northern Maine, right? And he was always one of these guys that wanted to tell you how to live your life, but he couldn't even like fix his own.
Right.
And he was trying to open a youth camp called Beacon of Light, where he
Yeah.
would help people learn to live a pure, wholesome, and successful life. Well, he's America under the Biden administration. So now it's like, we've got to sober up. We've got to hit the gym. We've got to put money back in the bank before we focus on anyone else. Because, as you know, like, if you're giving away tons of money to charity and then you lose your job, you stop giving away money to other people that need it because you need it. You stop giving away resources. You focus on you because you got to put your mask on before you put it on your child. And we're in that situation.
And I just want to add one thing here to kind of piggyback onto what I was saying earlier. What you're seeing, in my opinion, is the early birth pangs of a, and I've been warning about this for a while, of a tripolar world. Yes, there are many other powers rising, but the three big ones right now
And
are
I guess Turkey.
No, well, that's one of the rising ones,
Right.
but United States, China, Russia, and Richard Rosskrantz's works, Randall Schweller Jr., they've all done deep dives on tripolar systems and where they lead. They usually lead to major war because they're inherently unstable. So what we need to do right now is get out of this Ukraine fixation and start figuring out how we're going to play the great game of great power politics. You can't avoid the big war if you're poking the bear in Ukraine. We've
No,
got to get
we're
out.
not. Yeah, I think, Brandon. I
The
think
United
you're
States
just,
is, and NATO is.
No,
Absolutely.
look, NATO was the defensive alliance, and every
In the Cold War, it was. In the
every
Cold War.
post-Soviet country that was not integrated into NATO got invaded by Russia sooner rather than later. So that's just the case. Anyone who came out of communism and wasn't integrated into a defense alliance got a war or civil war within the 30 years. I can give you all 11 examples, and it's 100% of the time. Sadly, anyone who does not get assimilated into a defensive compact and as a weak country gets walked over by their next door neighbor. And Ukrainians, I wish were not in the situation, but they are. My answer to you, Brian, ultimately is, even if you don't care about Ukraine, you have
I didn't say that. Just
Okay.
for the record.
fine. Even if you don't care as much about Ukraine as you do about America,
Of course, I care about America first and foremost.
Good, that's great. But the alliance that we built after World War II has been good for America, has made Americans safe and
It's been
rich.
great for Europe.
Wonderful.
It's been pretty good for Europe, yeah.
Oh,
and
it's been great.
glug,
They
glug,
don't
drinking
have
the
to
wine.
spend on
Uh,
their defense.
Importing the migrants in, all of that.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's been good for Europe.
I mean,
and
look, I was just in. Sorry, I'll let you. I just got to say, I was
Please.
just in Vilnius, and beautiful country. I love. It's my first
Lovely.
time in Lithuania. Lovely
Lovely.
country, but I'm watching these people all day long in the middle of the week getting wonderful pastries and pushing, and they all dress their kids like little stuffed animals with the little ears on the hoods. You know what I mean?
they do,
and-
yes.
Adorable, adorable country. But I'm looking at that. I'm thinking there are about a huge percentage of my countrymen in America who save all year or try to save all year
Good
to have
luck
a
saving.
vacation that looks like this for 5 days. And then when I asked my contact over there Like, what's the chief economy here, at least in Vilnius? He said non-profits.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
the thing is, it's like, whether that's
Yeah.
true or not, the point is, when you, like,
It's a joke.
Brandon, what is our budget on defense right now? What's average?
It's just shy of $1 trillion. It's
Okay.
It's about 880.
So the thing is,
billion.
when you
it's
don't
just
like,
shy of $1 trillion.
if you don't have to
850,
spend,
880.
if
Yeah,
you
I
don't
think
have to
880,
spend on
yeah.
defense, and with the exception, Poland is, Turkey certainly is,
Poland is, yes.
Greece is, because they got
Poland
Turkey to
is.
deal with. But look at the response to Starmer from Germany and France. They're like,
On this I agree. No, on this I agree with you.
1.9% in
Brian.
Canada. For
Brian,
Jesus.
I agree with
All of us
you.
are going to agree that
100%.
Europe needs to spend more money on
100%.
defense.
I'll stop.
Yes.
Vlad. Go ahead, please.
You're right. Look, you're right. There've been freeloaders for a long time. I wish they'd all triple their defense budget tomorrow. On this, you and I agree, 100%.
Mhm. Yeah.
That said, it's like Roman Empire and they're Greece, and we have to protect what's left of our civilization. And Americans
Why do
do
we
come
have
from
to?
Europe, most of us.
No. That's
I don't have to protect Ireland.
I don't have to. Yeah.
Well,
Well,
we can play it out though.
Ireland's not in NATO, man.
Let's play the
I don't have
potentialities
to
out
protect
over
the
here. 'Cause
Ivory
here-
Coast, where my grandfather's from.
Here's the great disagreement, I think, what's going on right now with, let's say, Brian and Brandon and Vlad and Mike, I think, as well. The
Yes.
big disagreement here is whether you guys think Russia is going to be satisfied with having Ukraine or whether it's going to proceed on.
That's not what I'm
No,
Right.
okay,
Well, that
that's
is
not
what
what
I
you're
was-
saying.
that's what I
Okay,
was
that's
talking
Brandon. Okay, that's what Brandon's saying. Now what Brian's
started out
saying.
with that.
Point made. Thank
Yes.
you, Brian.
I
So
don't agree with him on everything.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So when it comes to whether or not
Yes.
Russia is going to go forward, if we approach this like scientists as much as we can, what evidence do we have to say that they will versus that they won't? We can rely on history. We can rely
Brandon,
on
how about what
the
evidence
invasion
we have
of-
to say that they can?
That they can. I'm sorry. That they can what?
That
Go.
they can advance. How far would they get? I mean, you see what I mean? And
Well,
and,
it's
and
contingent. Look, it's really
Yeah.
contingent on. It's contingent on how much longer the Ukrainians are going to keep throwing people into the meat grinder, because once they run out of people, which they will, the Russians can then just have their way. And this is what I'm trying to avoid when I say get a peace deal. And
they can, but what I'm Brandon, I'm talking about the whole talking point of they're holding back the threat to democracy. And what I'm
Sure.
saying is, if they can't get past Ukraine, per what the
I don't think they're
going
going to get past Ukraine.
How could they get past the rest of the EU?
Yeah, look, I used
I mean,
to
if
do
I
work with
can
the
pop in
Polish.
there whenever Brandon's done.
I
I'll
wrote just
stop.
real quick.
I'm sorry.
I used to do work with the previous Polish government. I participated in some of the Baltic Storm exercises that NGA ran, and
Right.
the Polish, the Poland will not be conquered again. They're working right now on basically turning themselves into a porcupine.
They are.
And that's what I was advising in 2017. The Polish government needed to do. That's what they needed to do. In fact, I might have gone too far on the Hill, and I said that they needed to develop tactical nuclear weapons capability that's independent of the United States. That's what I think. I think that's fine. That's self-defense. Okay. I don't believe the Russians are seriously interested in absorbing Poland. I don't believe. In fact, there is a Russian that I speak to fairly regularly now, who is close with the Russian government. We'll just say that. And in the conversations I have had with him, the consistent theme is there is absolutely no appetite on the part of the Kremlin, and you can take from this what you will, but there is absolutely no appetite on the part of the Kremlin to go really even into Western Ukraine unless they feel they have to, let alone go beyond. And they've just shown, remember, Putin opened the war with the idea that he's going to do this blitzkrieg into Ukraine. He's going to 3-day war, and they're going to take Kyiv. And again, that I give the Ukrainians credit. They stopped that from happening, and that was the moment they should have negotiated. But the point is, the Russians, I think, fundamentally understand that they're not going to, it's not worth their time going beyond the part of Ukraine rather, that they have been holding on to this entire time, which is the eastern part of Ukraine, the traditional Russian speaking area, and of course Crimea. And that's a whole nother thing, by the way, the Sevastopol port, that is a huge component. And in my book, I mean, we don't have to get into it here, but there's a whole port strategy that NATO has been employing against Russia, Crimea is one of them.
I think the
Wait,
Crimea is the
before anybody else
secondary,
responds, before
Yes.
anybody else
I'm sorry,
responds, I have
Mike. I'm sorry, Mike. I know you wanted to go.
No, no, totally fine.
Oh, wait. Before Mike, I have a quick question for Brandon, real quick. Just my own curiosity here. I got to know. Why wouldn't they just lie to you? Why wouldn't the Russians you're speaking with just lie to you?
No,
And why
I
should you
fully
believe them?
acknowledge. Listen, I fully acknowledge. I speak to a lot of Ukrainians who I've caught lying to me. It is what it is.
Come
That's
on.
part of the business that I'm in. So I opened my statement by saying, take from that what you will. But to be fair, since beginning conversations with this individual, everything he has told me has pretty much come to pass in terms of what the thinking is. And I write about this at the National Interest. I write about this at the Age of Times. And so I'm very cognizant though that this could be a propaganda thing. And that's why I opened my statement with take with that what you will. But so far in speaking with this individual, a lot of what he has said has come to pass. And I do believe that there is an understanding on the part of Putin that while he may be able to eventually get all of Ukraine, it's probably not worth the headache because it has not been all a bed of roses for Russia. And I fully acknowledge that. So, and then, like I said, the Russians, a lot of Russians that I'm hearing from in the countryside whose families are fighting the war directly, they're saying they're PO'd at Putin because he's talking about doing a deal. They want to go all the way to Kyiv and they want to burn it down.
And before Mike, one real quick follow-up to that, real quick. When we consider that,
I gotta go
when
in
you
5
were talking,
minutes, Gents.
okay.
Okay.
When
It was
when
nice
we
meeting you,
consider
Vladislav.
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
too,
Okay,
Vlad.
he's got 5 minutes. Okay,
Oh,
so I'm going to be as quick as possible. So when
Yes.
we consider, Brandon, what you're talking about here, if we were in Putin's shoes, the shoes of the Russian government,
Yes.
surely you would have a deal where you would have a lot more allotment than just 45,000 troops for Ukraine if you would want to push back and say, okay, guys, enough is enough. Just again, me, naive Lev over here, looking at this number of 45,000 troops in the 2002 peace summit
2022?
there.
Yeah.
Yeah, 2022. To me, that just seems like a spit in the face of anybody with common sense here. If you were Putin, wouldn't you say, all right, guys, we're going to give, like a sufficient amount of military people. We have this part, you have this part. Let's just like agree to disagree and shake on it.
Yeah.
This just looks like, hey, you stupid, naive Westerners, fuck you. We're going to give you this low number and you're going to take it and we're just going to go. And you're probably going to take it anyway because we think like you're so dumb and naive. Like we fear China and we don't fear you. You're a bunch of pussies. You're a bunch of pushovers because you don't know history. But anyway.
Well, I will just say 1994, the agreement between NATO and Russia over Ukraine was that Ukraine would be neutral. And Ukraine was not neutral. And this was the trigger point for the initial issue with Russia over Ukraine with us. So, Putin saying, I want a paltry force in Ukraine and any agreement, this is in the context of his understanding as he sees it, that the Americans in NATO have never played fairly, that we have always said we support a neutral Ukraine and Ukraine has never been neutral. And that's not to say that the Russians weren't doing their own nefarious things. Again, I fully concede.
They were.
I have this in my book. I fully concede this. But the point I'm making is the bigger picture is you're talking about what Putin thinks. And
Yes.
I've spent a lot of time analyzing him and, Putin is talking contextually. He feels he cannot trust Ukraine, and he said this actually recently. He feels that he cannot trust Ukraine with a larger force of NATO-backed troops because it will lead to what happened between 2014 and 2022. Now, obviously, Russia initiated the invasion. I'm not denying that. However, there is a series of triggers that the West engaged in that Putin perceived as hostile. And that's the context of why he's saying a paltry force.
And you could understand, like, from the background when people look at it, you wouldn't blame them for seeing this as now Russia could just go in at any time and break its promise, just like it did with the...
Certainly.
yeah.
I know, I acknowledge that. But here's the thing. Right now, at least, and I know this is true. Right now, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump have a very unique relationship because, as Putin has said, he does not believe Trump is from the men in gray suits. Now, Putin believes some of this stuff. Putin really believes that there's a conspiracy, and I think there might have been on some level on our side against him. He knows Trump is not from that realm, and he believes it is worth taking a risk to get a deal. But that window is closing rapidly. And the key, I'm going to finish and I'll let you talk. The key point, we go back to this every time, and we have to. Putin has been very consistent. No new weapons into Ukraine, and we can start an honest negotiation, and we have yet to do this. And that is why we keep going back to the cycle of violence, because the Russians do not want advanced NATO weapons flowing in to Ukraine.
I mean, I don't think that Putin respects or cares about Donald Trump. He sees him as somewhat of a patsy and somewhat of
That's
a
your opinion.
madman and a wild man who needs to be massaged and who can be very dangerous, a very dangerous figure because he operates under madman theory, can't be controlled. Russiagate was indeed a conspiracy theory, and Russiagate was a major issue between Donald Trump and Putin. But fundamentally, Putin is all in with his life and existentially into the thing. He has no interest in stopping this war. He's no interest in a ceasefire. He's no interest in anything like an armistice, short of domination of Ukraine and regime change in Kiev, and even hopefully my Odessa hometown, the port of Odessa. He wants that also. He has, again, to repeat, no interest in a ceasefire, and the only thing to do is to keep supporting Ukraine because he advances when he sees weakness and he pulls back when he sees strength. It's just the way it is. I'm sorry to say we don't agree.
Understood. I don't agree, but
what
I
can we do?
I don't agree. And also, I gotta say, I want to say this really quick. And Mike, I think you were going to get in there too, but I do want to say there. The way most people talk about war is they're focused on the hardware of war. Like, he's going to put a bunch of troops on the ground. He's going to do all this. But I never hear anyone talking about the software of war and what is the goal of war. So if you look at the goal of war, if you look at the goal, like if you want to dominate Europe, let's just say that's the case. If you want to dominate Europe, does it matter how you dominate them? Does it matter if it's militarily dominated or that you own their source of fuel and economy? Does it matter to the Chinese how they respectfully how they dominate the world?
I was saying yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes,
There's a delay. Sorry. How they dominate the world. It doesn't matter how they get there. It doesn't matter if there's a military solution. And for both of these countries, it's like, hey, you know what? If my goal is this, if my goal is to, have Europe bend the knee to Russia, well, they're bending the knee now because they've increased their imports of Russian fuel. They need them more than Russia needs them. No, I'm sorry. They mutually need each other. So I respectfully disagree with you that Russia wants to keep it going because it's bad for business. And at the end of the day, throughout history, every little investigation I've done to every major, to the Egyptians taking land to make beer, it all comes down to resources. And resources are money, and money and resources are power. So it doesn't matter if you have troops on the ground. It doesn't. And right now, it seems like Ukraine is just in the way of everyone getting back to business.
I got to get in here real quick. I'm sorry. Brian, what you're saying, it's very reasonable. But I believe we talked about this before when you were on BTR. The big difference that I see here, and I understand that you have so much more experience than I do when it comes to a lot of these on-the-ground things. When it just comes to the Russian nature, Russian character, whatever you want to call it, be it, if you will, my collective family trauma from, decades on back in the USSR and all these things. What I'm perceiving, and I noticed that you even made kind of a face when I was talking about how the Russians perceive Americans, is that I think Americans...
No, I'm sorry. My dog did something, and I can't figure out where he did it.
I think
that was the face when I was looking around.
That's okay. That's okay. I think Americans, from a Russian perspective, are very nice, Christian, law-abiding people who want there to be, they expect they expect Russia to be reasonable. They think, well, why wouldn't Russia just, oh, that's adorable. Why wouldn't Russia just listen to reason? They can understand that surely they would want to make money, like why have all this stuff? And this, I think, is the biggest disconnect of all when it comes to how they see China. It's very psychological when it comes to them seeing China as this, robot, sadist, punisher, all the way back to the Mongols. That was the unfortunate result of Russian people being dominated by the Mongolians for a long time. They have this relationship towards these Eastern despots, which is reflected in how their leadership affects the Russian people themselves. And the reason why I'm saying all this is they would look at anything that Americans do that's common sense, that's nice, that, lifts up all the ships, why can't we all just get along and make money? And they spit at it. They find it detestable. They find it absolutely naive. And that's what I'm saying. They're like, you stupid Americans, you think that we're going to play along with your, common sense. Everybody's, no, fuck you. We want to destroy you. We hate you. We detest you. We detest your very essence. And that's the thing that I think is completely missing from this conversation. I don't know how that bridge can be built, but maybe it'll require...
Just so I understand what you're saying,
yeah.
I think I was making that point. It's like and by the way, I don't think it's... anyone, especially now, is able to say Americans feel this way, because right now there's about 3 Americas, if not more.
Maybe,
and I think what's happening is, and Brandon had said earlier, the respect from Putin to Trump, that doesn't mean he likes him,
right?
That means he respects him. It's like, I don't like the arch enemy criminal who, I don't like Bane and Batman, but I respect him. And so the thing is, it's like, but what I see is, especially with China, it's about money. And that's what it comes down to. It comes down to money, because money is power.
Brian, I would like to agree with you. I'd like to say that my defense of America giving more weapons and intelligence and arms and time to Ukraine is based on the fact that even though I think Putin is going towards a completely crazy and vicious goal, he's still a rational, somewhat rational calculator.
I don't think he's
cost
crazy
benefit.
or vicious at all. I think he's very methodical, and he comes from, I spent 25 to 30 years of my adult life in the very same, on the opposite side of the ocean, world he did, and not just sitting at a desk in a cubicle doing tactical operations and recruitments and interacting and embedding. And
I think you're a normal guy, and he's not.
No.
I think that's very dangerous. I think it's very dangerous when people start, turning them into this great mythical monster. I actually think Putin,
he's not a mythical monster. He's kind of a monster.
But most world leaders are.
But what is? I mean, I think
Brandon, I would necessarily.
Brandon, I would say this. I think the biggest problem that most Westerners and Europeans, and especially people who have not been in an acutely dangerous situation over and over, you come to realize that people just think differently, but they have their own goals. So, like, is China, Lev kind of alluded to this, is China evil to us, but not to them?
Right.
Is Russia evil to, mainly the people on the left, I hate to say, in the United States, but not to their own people? Okay,
to their
own. I totally disagree with that.
I'm not saying he's a great leader. So I think everyone has interests, and I think, I think it's like this. I said this a million times, the Cold War was supposed to be this horrible thing, but you know what? The world was a safer place during the Cold War. And when you have a bunch of giants that could all take each other out, except not 3, like Brandon said, but it was a lot more balanced than when we were a superpower then, but
Brian.
we became a hyperpower, and that is a problem.
But Brian, here's the real big difference, though. Back during the Cold War, the USSR had checks to power because you had the KGB and you also had the Communist Party, and they were not the same. They checked each other out. But more important, the point that you were bringing up, Brian, about Russians caring about Russians, that's where the disconnect is, man. That is the complete difference. Because
Russians,
I did not.
I said
you said
Russia.
caring about their people.
I said Russia cares about Russia. I didn't say about
what
people.
Is Russia? What is Russia, though?
National interests. National interests.
Here I
Okay.
disagree too. I disagree too because
Brian, we disagree.
yeah.
We really disagree. I don't think Putin is really.
Okay.
I think he could care less about Russian national interests, and I think he's really bad for
Well,
Russia.
how do you define those national
Well,
interests?
I don't. Like,
I don't.
what are we
I don't
talking
think.
about? then?
I'm sorry.
I don't really. What do you mean? He doesn't care about Russian national interests. Are you talking
I mean,
about
That's
how he
absurd.
defines
Why would he
it,
be fighting?
or-
Why would he be
Right.
leading?
He's fighting for regime survival and for expansion.
So he does
that-
care about national
He
interests.
cares
if that's
about-
it.
But those are not national
I don't think
interests.
regime
I mean, look,
survival is
this
necessarily in
war-
the national interest.
Well, who sets
Correct. Thank you,
national
Mike.
interest?
Yeah,
It's
who
the
sets
regime.
national interests? That's a good point.
Regime. It's the regime.
Mike,
It's the regime.
Do you want to argue for that?
Yeah, I mean, I actually have to go in a minute.
I
It's
think we
almost-
all do. But go
Yeah,
ahead.
honestly, I
Go
can eat
for
some
it.
dinner. But generally, I think, I mean, defining national interests is something that changes, like you said, based on the regime. That's true. But the actual survival of the person at the top is not really the national interest, right? If Joe Biden said he wanted to stay in power for another 4 years, even though he wasn't reelected, would that be in the national interest? I don't think so. I think that would
Well,
be
I didn't say it
in
was
his
Putin's
interest.
survival
Possibly.
that was the national interest.
But the regime survival. That was something that Vlad was bringing up.
Yeah,
That's
And
what
I
I'm
think
saying,
the
yeah.
survival of the regime is not
Correct.
necessarily coterminous with Russia's national interests as such.
And the flip side, look,
Thank you.
yes,
That's exactly what I wanted to say. Thank
understand.
you.
Yes, but the flip, and I agree. I understand what you're saying, but the flip side is, and I'm not defending Putin, but the flip side is, the Putin people are going to say, we had regime change once in the 90s and it left Russia on its knees. So this is the regime we've got, and this is who we're sticking behind. If you talk to Russians today about the war, most Russians, they may not love the war, but they're now all in and they're behind Putin. There's a reason, Putin has been, in the media, he's been killed and brought back to life 30 times in the last 4 years. He had MS, or he was going to be overthrown, or he was going to, none of that's true. None of that was true. It was all
Yeah.
bullshit. Excuse my
Wait,
language.
Brandon, do you remember what Putin was doing in the 90s?
Yeah, at one point, wasn't he a cab driver? I mean,
No,
he was,
no. Here's what he was doing in the 90s. He was, well, number one, he was stationed in Germany before that, part of
Right,
the
as
KGB.
KGB
But after
in
that,
Dresden.
he was deputy vice mayor, or he was
Right.
deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, and where my
Petersburg.
family's from. My family even met him one time. We have connections and all of that. What he was doing, he was smuggling cocaine from the harbor
I'm
of
sure
St.
he
Petersburg
was.
with the money that the evil empire of the United States and Europe were sending to aid the Russian people after the Soviet Union fell. He was taking all that coke that he was buying with that aid money and he was selling it to his friends. And later on, he killed Sobchak, who was the mayor of St. Petersburg.
So was he Hunter Biden's supplier?
right.
Exactly. Yeah.
No,
But the point. No. But real quick, the point
You
that I'm
did set
getting
that one
at
up.
is that there is this impression of there was like this bad regime in Russia, and then Putin came and they cleaned up the oligarchs. He was the fucking
not-
oligarch.
he's
He
not
was
that.
running
hold
shit.
on.
Yeah.
I'm not denying that he's a bad guy.
He's
I'm
a
not
mobster,
denying
bro.
No, but he was
He's a mobster.
running
I
Russia.
call it a gangster's paradise. I define Russia
Yeah.
as a gangster's paradise. So I
Yes, it
agree
is.
with you. What I'm saying though is that the Russian, the Siloviki, build themselves as they were, forgive me, going to make Russia great again. After the decade of the 90s, this was how they sold themselves. And a lot of people bought it. A lot of people agreed because they looked at the 90s and they said, you know what? It didn't work out. It didn't work out what we were doing with capitalism and democracy. We're going to go back to the default. And what is the default? Vladimir Putin, to me, is in the context of Russian history. He is no worse than Peter the Great or Catherine the Great. They've all been autocrats, the Silnaya Ruka. This is what they do over there. I don't really care. At
But
the end
Brandon,
of the day.
as a Ukrainian nationalist, I agree with everything you just said.
There we go.
There you go.
Look,
That's a
we're
good
able
point.
I
to
just want to
make.
say the last four things you
Yes.
said, I agree with that.
There we go. See, break the rules. This is the power of the show. We are
Okay,
actually
let's
able
end
to.
at that. I think that's a good
Yes.
way
It was
to
nice talking
Lev,
to you,
Lev,
Vlad.
we're
Right,
supposed
Jen-
to say that. Other people are supposed to say that about your show, not you.
I don't
Right,
care.
right.
I'm
Lev,
the host.
power
I
of
say
your
whatever I
show is
want.
that we do find common ground, and
Yeah.
we do. And look, I want to say this too, and Mike should
Yes.
definitely get a word in. Sorry, Mike, but
Don't worry
I
about
want to
it.
say what I see here in zooming out from this whole debate. What I see is two really good things. But the problem is it can't debate because we have a human-centric point of view and then we have an organizational point of view.
Yes.
And so, one's arguing against the other, and it's kind of like when someone got on me and they said, "Man, you fire a lot of people." I'm like, "They're freaking contractors. They got to go."
Yeah.
And they're like, "But they have families." I don't care. I have to make
Right.
profit. So somewhere in the middle, but so I see where we're coming from, and it's been good for me. To your point, Lev, this show does that. I think that's the big disconnect, and I've kind of been feeling that, but I see it more in this debate. Is that there's two different points of view trying to win, and they're both important, I guess, but not always right or wrong, but they're both important because people ask, "Do I care?" Of course I care. I'm a father too. I have a cute puppy, but the thing is, cute puppy says I care more than kids these days, but still. But the thing is, it's like, of course I care, but at the same time, if I don't operate under a healthy, functioning organizational structure, which does have to break a few eggs sometime, then everyone perishes.
Yeah, and I think that's a very reasonable.
Yeah.
I think that's a reasonable split in terms of trying to silo, understanding where people are coming from.
Yeah.
I just think the difference too is that I think we also can come at it from a very organizational perspective. I think I generally do. I just think we disagree on what the aims and what the best interests of that organization are, and that's totally reasonable. That's why you have democracy to fight this stuff out and argue it over, and that's why it's good to have a show like this where we can do this in a way that's respectful and meaningful.
Totally. Yeah. And by the way, I'm surprised to hear this from you, Mike. You're an accountant, apparently.
Formerly used to be an accountant.
I've been stalking your LinkedIn.
Yeah, former CPA, no longer. Yeah, I left that behind.
Mad respect on your independent journalism, by the way.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Who views in New York? Brian, you're in New York?
Yeah, so I live in Hudson Valley right now. I'm up literally in the woods. There's a bear probably tearing my garbage apart. And then I also have a place in Brooklyn, and then I also have a place in Salem because we have multiple kids.
Okay. Well, when you're in New York, let me know. We can have a drink. Yeah.
I'll be in Brooklyn next week.
I'm coming back from Poland on the 4th or 5th. Yeah.
I'm going to Iceland on the 4th or the 5th. So yes.
All right, so
look at your jet over here.
Where in New York? Are you in Brooklyn? Are you in Manhattan? Where are you at?
I stay half the time in Hell's Kitchen and half the
we
time
could do this after the show. We could do this after the show.
All right, Jen, nice to meet all of you. I had a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Okay, so before we go, I just want to say one final thing. This has been an amazing conversation. It was very, tense at times, but that's a good thing because I think we're all coming at this from a point of view from good faith. Yeah, emotions, but also good faith. Like we want to have the best for the United States. I want to have the best for the United States. My last thing that I would say, what I want to avoid when it comes to Ukraine, you mentioned soft power, Brian. I don't want Russia to keep going. And we're not going to have like the argument right now, but just like my 2 cents as far as what I see happening. If Russia, let's say, is able to take Ukraine, and then let's say it is going to be able to keep going, and Poland being porcupine, maybe that's not going to be enough, and Article 5 is just a piece of paper, yada, yada, yada. What I personally want to avoid, I don't want America to be dragged into something that is way larger, World War III level, when it comes to a hot European war. I 100% want to avoid that at all cost. And the question is, are there choices that are good here? Because like Thomas Sowell always says, there's no such thing as solutions, there's only trade-offs. And I want to be very aware of what the trade-offs are of, okay, so let's say a part of Ukraine falls. Does that mean, as Brandon says, that Russia would still, stop at a particular point and not go further? And if it does go further, what happens then with Poland and the Baltics and so on and so forth, like a lot of the Russian people, the generals and Medvedev and so on, we're talking about in the Russian media. That aside, if that does happen, then the concern would be how much would America have to contribute at that point? It would be more than 6% of the defense budget, and now we're really screwed. So number one, I want to avoid that. And number two, what I want to avoid is, let's say we're in such an America first mindset during this hot European war that we decide, you know what, guys, we're going to just shelter up, turtle up, never mind what happens to Europe, let Russia take whatever, it's going to take, let Europe fight off the rest of it. And at that point, the concern is that if you have a Russia that's still owned by China, and it will be owned by China, then the soft power that China is going to be able to inflict on the rest of the West, including the United States, imagine way more than just one Gavin Newsom when it comes to rolling out the red carpets for Xi Jinping.
We're already owned by China. We're already there, man. Like it's already, yeah. It's already happening.
67% of the world is in the Belt and Road Initiative. All of our Metro Rail are made by CRRC, which is the biggest train maker and now headquartered in Springfield. Most of our water, Smithfield Pork, which does chicken and pork as well. I could go on and on. ZPMC, the crane makers who basically have most of the cranes in most of the major ports from LA to Kalama, to the Port of Elizabeth or the Port of Newark, who could literally, if they wanted, flip the boats upside down. And they actually found this weird device that could transmit out on a bunch of these cranes just 3 weeks ago. So I agree with you, but I would say flash ahead, just hit the fast forward button. We're way beyond that now. Right now, it's about getting them out. And I don't know if that's possible.
I couldn't agree more.
We got to get them
That's
out.
a whole
Gotta get 'em
other
out.
And
conversation.
this is the bit.
Gents, we got to get them out.
Wait, you got to get them out. Okay, wait.
Agreed.
Before we go, I agree with you 100%, Brian. The one thing that I would say, though, is that in terms of these Thomas Sowell-like trade-offs, here, if we don't do anything, we say, well, China already has all this power over us. And I know that that's not what Trump is doing, and I'm very happy about that. The fact that he wants America to be a lot more self-sufficient, not rely on China, that I think is key. I want to make sure that while that is going on, there's not going to be the hard power that's going to be applied onto the rest of Europe through China's dog of Russia. And that would create a really bad situation. Because, yes, we are fighting a war on two fronts.
I would say, like, the fentanyl that comes directly from Wuhan, I would say the maritime wars from the the red maritime brigades of the Chinese fishing boats. I would say the Filipino clashes. This is kinetic war.
Absolutely.
It's
Agreed.
we don't hear about it a lot, but what I'm saying is they're moving fast. Okay, and
all the more reason we have to keep our ears open with all the
and
things we
not
talked
get
about today.
entrenched in Ukraine. That's why.
Unless that's going to cause Russia to go into the rest of Europe. That's the war on two fronts I'm
why
talking
would they
about.
want to? It makes no sense.
Why wouldn't they want to?
What
It's
does it
like
even
there's
matter?
no opposition.
It's like when people say
does it
the
even
military made the vaccine to kill Americans. It's like, why would you kill your only customers? What's the point? You see what I mean? It's like, why would they?
Look, the bottom line is at this point, the hemorrhaging is so bad in the United States. We got to pick, and this is my buddy Colby talks about this all the time. You got to pick your battles, and the battle's in the East. It is not in the West. It's not in Europe.
So you're a Bridge guy.
Bridge is a friend of mine. I've known Bridge for years.
I like Bridge, but I don't agree with him on some things.
Oh, of course I wouldn't expect you to.
There we go.
But my view.
But Bridge, I have to say, he has changed his mind based on conversations with smart people. So I respect him.
Yeah. Well,
There we go, guys. I think we figured it out. We figured out where
it was great talking to you all.
It was
Same
great
here.
talking to you, Brandon.
And Brandon, thanks.
Where can we
for
find all you
coming in.
guys? I want to make sure we plug everybody. So, Brandon, where can we find you? Where can we buy your books?
I am a senior national security editor at The National Interest. I'm also a contributor at Popular Mechanics. And you can buy my books wherever they're sold. Probably, and I wish I could say go local, but probably the best bet will be on Amazon. There's 4 of them.
Sure.
And the other question, my social media, you can find me on Twitter, Getter, and Truth Social under the same handle at the Brandon.
The Brandon.
Mhm.
Okay.
And I just want to say about Brandon really quick. It's fascinating to me that he covers space and Iran all the way back to the ancient times and China biohacking or bio warfare and Ukraine. And I can't tell you what he's working on next, but it's fascinating.
It's on the Arctic. It's on the
broad
race for the
spectrum.
Arctic.
The race for the Arctic.
sounds
It's
very interesting. I would
amazing.
read that.
Yeah. His books are great. I highly
It's
recommend
proceeding at a glacial
Yeah.
pace. It's my dad humor.
That's books right there, right?
That's what happens.
We won't let that
okay.
hell freeze us
Well,
over.
Brandon, I would definitely love to have you back.
No,
I know we had these
you've got
backs
my
and forths, but-
you've got my contact info, so
Yeah.
just ping me. It seems like it's a little bit more looser here, where I can just kind of jump on. So let's
keep the conversation
Yeah.
going. We now
It's
have
always
a
nice to be
good
in a place
a
where you
good
can
thing
break
to
the
focus
rules.
on. There we
Ooh.
go.
All
That's
right,
right.
gents.
All right, guys. Have a good night.
Bye bye.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
night.
All right,
And
see you later.
Brian, where could we find you, Brian?
You can find me on X at Brian with an I as in India, Brian O'Shea, SPI, Sierra Papa, India. No, that doesn't mean I'm a spy. I used to have a company called Stryker Pierce Investigations,
Nice.
which I guess made me a spy. You can find me on, but the best place to find me really is on dailyclout.io. If you go to dailyclout.io, you're going to see a whole host of shows there. Click on my show called Investigate Everything. I prefer people watch it on Rumble, and we really do. We actually, our most popular topic, big surprise, is Luigi Bongione. But I get the crowd involved in the investigations, and it's really a great way to make the entire country and world of free people a slow or no-go zone for people that try to impede others' freedoms. And that's the whole point of investigating everything.
That's
is
great.
casting a million flashlights on a million evils.
That sounds
Great.
great. And Mike,
Awesome.
where can we find you?
Yeah, so I'm mostly on Twitter or X. I still can't get over calling it X, so that's Twitter for me. I'm at RATL Policy, Rational Policy. Yeah, my face does not look the same as it does here. It's an avatar of my boy H.H. Kitchener from the Great War. Also, you can find my writing over at National Review, Commentary, Providence Magazine. And then hopefully in the next year or so, I'll have a book out. So on history, though, I'm working on my after my graduate work on the origins of World War I. So if you're into that, stay tuned.
Great.
Excellent.
Lovely.
And Vlad, where can we find you?
I'm on Twitter. I'm on Tablet Magazine, Foreign Policy. I'm switching sinecures at this moment. I'm going to be in Poland this week. Just find me on Twitter. I'm on there a lot, and on Instagram. So it's Davidson Vladislav on Twitter, and I wrote 2 books on Ukraine. And I also do a lot of literary criticism and art criticism, and I make art, and I teach art history. That's what I do. So
Beautiful.
yeah.
And you guys can find me at LevPo on Twitter. And we're going to be having next week Jason Giorgiani. Finally, we're going to be doing the Patreon episode. I know I've been talking about next week. We keep pushing it. It's happening next week, guys. Be there or be square. Patreon.com/breaktherules. Support the show. You're not going to regret it. And if you happen to be New York City, just like Mike and Vlad and Brian is going to be as well, if you become a $20+ member, you are going to be able to be in the audience for a lot of the shows. Vlad, you were there for the show with Curtis Yarvin, and that was great. And we have a rooftop there, so you can go on the rooftop, have a good party. You have a nice view of like the Manhattan skyline.
It's very nice.
Yeah, and then we could go out drinking, have a good time. So, guys, these are the benefits of becoming a part of this circle that breaks all of the other circles. That is my mission, Brian.
Thank you, Lev, for having us.
Thank you guys for being
Thank you,
here.
Lev. Appreciate
Take
it.
care.
We appreciate
Have a good
it,
night,
Lev.
guys.
Bye-bye.
All right, thanks.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Great. Nice to meet you guys.
Same here.
That was great.